Okay, welcome to the book club on Codependency for Dummies by Darlene Lancer. And my name is Dana Morningstar. This is a book club we do the last Thursday of every month. And see who's hopping on here real quick. I do this every single week. I always think I'm going to remember things, and then I get so nervous that I don't. So I just thought for a second if I had the author's name wrong. Oh, hey, no, I don't. Darlene Lancer, that's her name, Codependency for Dummies. Oh, and I look up and there's a bunch of people here. Hello, everybody. We have Desmond, Healthy Love, Angelique, James, AJ, Lauren, Bear, Leslie. Welcome, welcome. Oh, Agatha. Okay, good deal. Maria uh, is here. Oh, I'm so excited that you're here tonight, Maria. And uh, oh my gosh, there's just so much to discuss. There's so much to discuss. So, and okay, so I had this other realization uh, earlier because I was like, man, I was talking about last night how I have so much anxiety every single live stream and how I'm trying to kind of shift how I understand those emotions. And I was listening to this podcast the other day, and she was saying, the podcast I was listening to was saying that she has the same feelings whenever she does any type of live stream or public speaking, and how she's trying to kind of reprogram herself and tell herself, these emotions of fear and anxiety and nervousness are stage fright, but it's also feelings of being brave and being courageous and putting yourself out there. And so I've been trying to kind of cultivate that. And so I was thinking today, what is it? Why do I feel so nervous every single time? And I think what it is because um it's just me. Like, it's just me here. I wish I had more of like the view, you know what I mean? How there's other people here discussing these things. And I totally understand how other people are not comfortable on camera. And that's, I get that. No hard feelings about that whatsoever. But I think I would feel significantly less anxiety if I had other people here. So uh I don't know. I don't know what that means, but I think it would be fun to meet up with people and then do like recordings and stuff about different topics, like live in a more like roundtable kind of discussion. So especially especially on books like this and topics like this, and uh, topics like this that are so big and can be so controversial, and uh, yikes. So I'm going to do the best I can with this book tonight. And, please just know that, you guys, this is just my opinion. This is one woman's opinion on things. And the thing that I love the most about these live streams is the collective. It's everybody's opinions, everybody's support, everybody's an understanding of things. I think that's really where the magic happens. And so, um, I guess just let that be said. And Maria says, and about the notes, it's an impossible book to summarize. Maybe instead of a full summary, just pick a few notes that you personally think the book covers really well and are insightful. That's good enough. Yeah, that's so I still haven't posted my notes on my website. I was still going through them as of like 4 o'clock today, trying to figure out how on earth, like how how am I even going to approach this book? There's so much information in here, and there's so much to kind of discuss and unpack. So one of the things that we were talking about last night was I'm going to do 2 live streams on this book. This first live stream, I'm going to try to get through like the first half of the book. And even then, I'm only going to be picking out, I think I have 5 or 6 points. It's still 12 pages of notes, but it's a lot less than like the 40 pages of notes that I had before. But I have quite a few notes on the first half that I feel are worthy of discussion. And I don't know. It was, and I don't, I love stuff like this. I love diving really into a topic and Googling stuff and kind of cross-referencing stuff. And, you just think about it in a different way when you're actually going to be discussing it, with people. So, interesting. And then Chris says, "Oh, hi." Have you seen The Disaster Artist? This is totally off topic. I just watched that movie the other night. Speaking of kind of strange, well, I guess we weren't speaking about that, but I guess this whole channel is about that kind of strange personalities that if you, it's just a very, really wild story. It's a behind the scenes movie about the making of the other movie called The Room with Tommy Wiseau. And I did not realize how much like mystery surrounded Tommy Wiseau. It was a very, very interesting movie. But he's kind of an ongoing joke in the film because he has this very kind of heavy Eastern European accent. He's like, "Oh, hi, Mark." Hi. And he really draws out his highs. Let's see. Let me scroll down. Oh, thank you so much, Colleen. She says, "Hi, Dana. First live chat with you. Your book, Start Here, helped immensely after my discard 2 months ago, and I've been learning from your videos ever since then. I just want to thank you so much." You are so very welcome. And thank you for letting me know that. That really means a lot. It's so awesome to be able like to have something that you do actually positively impact somebody else. It's just the coolest feeling in the whole wide world. And and then for those of you that were not here last night, I got my second book. I actually got the book in the mail yesterday. And so it's for real. Like it's a legit book. Like I wrote a legit book. So that's super exciting. And I'm still waiting to get my first copy of my book, which hopefully will be here in like the next week or so. But second book is called Out of the Fog, and it compares and contrasts a lot of the concepts that are in the first book. Start Here. So just if you're interested in that one. But that was a big victory for me. When the Narc Barks says, "Dana, I have this off feeling about someone and I feel confused. Is it a sign?" Yes. Yes, it is a big sign. So we'll get into that real quick and then we'll get into the book. But times like that when you're feeling really knocked off balance and you're like, "Man, I'm not sure really what's going on here." It's a really good time to take a few steps back emotionally and physically and kind of get grounded. And that whole concept, from Psychopath Free that I just love, I keep mentioning, where he talks about, finding a constant and thinking about that person in your life that you feel safe and secure and comfortable and grounded with. Think about how you feel with them. And so when you feel knocked off balance with other people, that can be a good reminder of you don't feel that way. You don't feel knocked off balance with everybody. It's just certain people. And it tends to be problematic people. And it tends to be the reason we're confused by it is oftentimes we're feeling knocked off balance and we're wanting the situation to be something different than it is. So we might get a funny feeling from like a neighbor or a teacher or a coworker or a new love interest. And we're hoping that it's not problematic, but then there's some part of us that it's registering that it is in fact problematic. And so that's where that confusion is cognitive dissonance at work. So if you're feeling that way, odds are there's something that's a problem that you're not wanting to acknowledge. So it's good to back up a bit and slow things way down. Don Ria says, "I don't like that title. Ain't no one a damn dummy." Yes, it's just, it's the dummy book series. So they have, car mechanics for dummies and knitting for dummies and cooking for dummies and all kinds of things. But yes, I agree. Not the best title, but my guess is she probably didn't have a choice in the matter. But yes, there's a lot of shame and embarrassment and confusion and people, already not feeling the best, struggling with low self esteem and all of that to begin with. But um, I think it's just part of the book series. So let's hop into this. And I will, like I said, chime in, comment down below, comment in the chat, and I'll get to as many comments as I possibly can. So let's just start off at the beginning. So what is codependency? And the author writes in here, codependency is a particular kind of dependency on others. It's insidious and powerful. It robs you of joy, peace of mind, and the ability to have sustained, loving relationships. It affects your relationship with yourself and limits your flexibility and the natural flow of relationships with others, including giving and receiving love and support and the ability to communicate, compromise, and problem solve. Shame and low self esteem make a person insecure, anxious, and dependent upon others' acceptance and validation. You may feel uncomfortable being yourself and be hypersensitive to perceived criticism or abandonment, even when neither exists. And oh gosh, there's so much here. So let's kind of segue into, I'm going to try to unpack this. I think there's not everybody that gets involved with an abusive person is necessarily codependent. And the way that I understand codependency is it's more of a dependency. It's when a person really kind of needs to feel needed or they don't feel complete unless they're with somebody else. And so that kind of mindset drives a person to stay in problematic relationships with friends, with parents, with, lots and lots of relationships, kind of you name it, because they they're looking toward to others in order to get validation, to get self-esteem, to get approval. There's oftentimes a lot of like people pleasing and this kind of behavior that goes along with codependency. So in my view, and we'll go through some of the more common definitions of codependency here too in a second, but my definition is it's more of like that Jerry Maguire saying of you complete me. It's really looking outside of ourselves, like we're an empty vessel and I don't feel love unless I'm loved. I don't feel validated unless you validate me. It's very much looking for other people to complete us. And of course you can see how that can become very problematic and even, incredibly problematic and dangerous and detrimental if a person has that mindset and they get tangled up with an emotional manipulator who, I mean, that's just the perfect storm to destroy a person that has kind of that bend in their personality. There's so codependency is oftentimes confused. You might have heard of, well, there's Stockholm Syndrome, and then there's also a term called empaths, or like, well, and there's another term called highly sensitive people. But so Stockholm Syndrome is where it's a term coined from a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden. And basically, the hostages were being held captive and they began to really focus on kind of these crumbs of kindness and um, of their captors and thinking, oh, these people weren't so bad after all. So it's, oh gosh, and I feel like I'm really struggling here. Abusive relationships are so complicated and there's so many different factors at play. Intermittent reinforcement is one. Kind of the sweet mean cycle is very much a part of Stockholm syndrome. Intermittent reinforcement. So like I was saying, not everybody that gets involved with an abusive person is necessarily codependent. These people are so incredibly manipulative and, um, and it's so easy for a person who's not solidly grounded in themselves to really get knocked off center and and also especially if the person's living a double life and there's not a lot of overt abuse, I if they get out of the especially if a person's dating, let's say, like a sociopath, when and if their partner's living a double life for 20 years and, they're treated very well, it's like, well, maybe they're not codependent. Like they just weren't aware of all of the deceit and the duplicity that their partner had because normal people really just don't even this is not on their radar of stuff to even think about as a possibility. So there's that. And then there's empaths. A lot of people that are empaths. So empaths can be codependent and codependents can be empaths, but they don't necessarily have to go together. And so empaths tend to be people that are highly in tune with the emotions of other people. And the difference between in my opinion, between codependency and empaths, it has a lot to do with intention and boundaries. So for and then I guess you could make the argument that probably a lot of empaths are that way because of some sort of it's like a learned behavior or some sort of dysfunction within their family that they had to learn how to be highly in tune with other people's emotions in order to kind of navigate their family life. So that would be my guess would be the vast majority of empaths out there grew up with one or more parents that were either incredibly narcissistic, emotionally unavailable, or they had to be caregivers. They were very much like the quote unquote adult child for whatever reason. Maybe they had a parent who was mentally ill. Maybe, in my case, I had a grandmother that had Alzheimer's who lived with us. And I had a brother that had dyslexia. And there was a lot of other kind of factors at play where I found myself very much in that caregiver role. And I didn't mind. I mean, on some level, I did mind, but most of the time, I really didn't because I loved them so much. But the the takeaway, and of course, was not a conscious thing until fairly recently. But the big message for me was that I really needed to put my wants and needs on the back burner because they needed more time and more energy and more attention and all of that. So I just kind of learned to be very independent and take care of myself. But I think especially growing up with and this was when I was in my teenage years, but later on in life, having a grandmother that had Alzheimer's, um, you become very in tune with emotions and wants and needs because she wasn't verbal. So you just learned like what certain looks meant, and I became very in tune with like body language and how to communicate with a person who was nonverbal. And and then that kind of set the tone for my and oh god, I feel kind of guilty even saying that really kind of set the tone for my whole life with being involved in different types of caregiver roles. But again, for me, I absolutely loved it, and it was something that I felt it became very natural for me, and that it was something that was very enjoyable and rewarding. Um, but the difference is, I think, for empaths is that it has to do with boundaries and intention. So, where a lot of codependent people that have codependency, it tends to be looking towards others for that validation, that approval, that feeling of, I need you to complete me. Whereas empaths don't really have that. It's more of I'm very hyper aware of what's going on with other people, especially other people that are, for me, that are in pain or that are going through a difficult time in some way, shape, or form. And boundaries can often be blurred because if you grow up like that, I mean, for me, like again, I always thought that that was um, fairly normal. Like, doesn't everybody kind of feel this way? And so I didn't realize that that wasn't the case until much later on in life. And I was continually shocked by different coworkers that I had in different caregiving fields that like weren't keyed in or um, to different patients, So but boundaries there. So for a lot of empaths, it can be this feeling of your emotions. I'm experiencing other people's emotions because you're so highly tuned in to what's going on with them. And then that really creates kind of this blurred boundary for sure. Because and it's exhausting because not only are you trying, you're living your life and you're experiencing your emotions, but you're also experiencing somebody else's emotions. So, and if a person's not aware that that's what's going on and that's what they're doing, then again, they can be very prime targets to get tangled up with emotional manipulators because we might find ourselves starting to like anticipate their needs and really getting sucked in by all of the manipulation and the guilt and feeling sorry for them and these kinds of things. Um, so one of the big lessons for me was to really separate that and to make sure that I had healthy boundaries. That empathic part of being really keyed in to people's emotions that are in pain, that have gone through trauma, all of that, that'll probably always be there. But it's only going to be healthy if I can have healthy boundaries and can understand kind of what are my emotions and what are their emotions, and um, realize when I'm carrying somebody else's emotions with me. So it's a process to kind of untangle that. Okay, let's see here. Let me scroll up and see what. So, okay, SL asks, do codependents take on the characteristics of a narcissist and they start acting like a narcissist? So, some yes, sometimes. So what oftentimes happens is if a person for a lot of people that struggle with codependency, it's their way of kind of navigating their environment or navigating relationships tends to be through like a lot of people pleasing, ingratiating type behavior, like um, being nice, always saying yes, always being agreeable, always putting other people first. But that oftentimes comes with a lot of built up resentment and anger and frustration, and it can be this mindset of, look at what I've done so much for you, and this is how you treat me. And it's this mindset that we should have somehow, we hey man, we earned it, we earned their loyalty, their honesty, their faithfulness, these things. But of course it doesn't work that way, especially with an emotional manipulator. And so a lot of codependents can then start really lashing out. And especially too, if a codependent person's in a relationship and in their mind, they're not going to leave. So they're like, you know what? I love this person, therefore They've got to change because I'm not going to leave. And they might point to any number of reasons. It's not within my culture, it's not within my religion, it's just not what I do. Commitment is forever is very much kind of the battle cry of the codependent. And um so because they can't leave, and if they're not comfortable having that assertive communication, which is oftentimes the case if you're in a relationship with a narcissist or a sociopath or a manipulative person, there is no honest communication. There is really only stonewalling and silent treatment and frustration and agitation and crazy making. So it's like there's so much denial that goes on and in those dynamics where the codependent person, the manipulator's lying, and the codependent person is going to try their hardest to believe them, which is inappropriate because there's no reason to believe them because they've got this whole huge past history of lying. But the codependent person so desperately needs this relationship to work for whatever reason that they're trying to force themselves to keep this relationship going, and they keep eating lies. But deep down inside, they know that that's what they're doing, and so you'll hear a lot of people that are in these dynamics, and they'll say like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just trust him or her? Or um, and then they feel guilty because they can't trust a person who's not trustworthy. And you can see that that's the path to hell, because you can't it's not appropriate to trust a person that's not trustworthy. So the one big thing the issue that I really take with kind of codependency in general is it really leaves out the huge degree of manipulation that's involved. So, it's one thing to be in a dynamic where a person feels like, I need this other person to complete me. And there's this definitely like enmeshment of boundaries, and these people go everywhere together, they do everything together. They really take to heart that two people become one. They're just very, very intertwined to an unhealthy degree. But when you're talking about being in a relationship with an emotional manipulator, it just spins a person all over the board to where they don't know what's up and what's down, and just the level of, twisted reality. It knocks, and I think on anybody, it's just going to knock anybody off center. So that's kind of my concern with it, is the only real fighting chance that any of us have against getting tangled up in manipulation is to be, fully grounded as much as possible within ourselves, to understand what manipulative behavior kind of looks like, how it goes down, and how it feels. That's probably the biggest thing, is how it feels, and really learning to tune into your emotions. It's and again, I mention this all the time, that stuff's not taught. And so a lot of people, even in healthy homes, I just don't buy that that stuff is taught. So, in healthy boundaries, assertive communication, it might happen within healthy families to some degree, but yeah, I know like I said, I've known many people that have come from healthy homes and that have gotten tangled up in abusive relationships, and um, you know, and they're so confused as to why. But these people, when our emotions get involved, when anybody has an emotional investment in a situation working out, they're not going to see it clearly, whether that's with a relationship, with a religion such as joining a cult, getting tangled up with like a financial scammer like Bernie Madoff, um, or a political dictator like Hitler. So there's just a lot to it. So let me touch on some other definitions of codependency here to kind of try to flesh out this whole picture. And here's the thing too with codependency, is even if you don't identify with the concept of codependency, there's still a lot of takeaways from this. The concept of boundaries, and learning to tune into your intuition, and learning to she's gives so many examples in here of different exercises, getting really to know yourself, and helping people to kind of get more into alignment is so, so critical. So so please, I guess what I'm saying is, please don't just dismiss this topic altogether. There's a lot of value in it, even if you don't agree with it 100%. So, okay, so here's some other definitions of codependency. From John and Linda Friel, codependency is a dysfunctional pattern of living originating both in one's family of origin and culture that leads to arrested identity development. Codependents overreact to external events while ignoring internal cues and feelings. Charles Whitfield defines codependency as codependents are alienated from their true self worth through wounding that occurs in childhood. Melanie Beatty says a codependent lets another person's behavior affect him or her and is obsessed with controlling that person's behavior. So that probably is definitely best seen if a person's living with an addict or an alcoholic. Um, the term codependency really originated, it was one of those concepts. So when they began studying families with an alcoholic, they found that not only were there patterns within the alcoholic themselves, like across the board, like, wow, all of these alcoholics tend to kind of do the same types of things. But what was interesting is so did their spouses and so did their children. And that's when they really began to look at like the family dynamics of all of this and how is all of this interconnected here. And um, so the spouse of the alcoholic tends to be very obsessed with controlling the alcoholic's alcoholism. But one of the things that they found, this is kind of what I was talking about earlier with codependents needing to be needed, is they were finding that the alcoholic needed the alcohol, but then their spouse tended to need the spouse needed to be needed. And so then oftentimes when the alcoholic, if the alcoholic did get sober, then the spouse was kind of left feeling like, well, now they don't need me. And then there was just kind of this loss of identity of like, well, now what? I was so used to being, this was my role. Like I needed to be needed. That's how I felt validated and loved. And now they don't need that anymore. They've got their 12-step program, they've got a therapist, they're sober, they're doing good. Now where am I in all of this? And so there's oftentimes a pattern of, if a person feels like that their role is to consistently just help other people, if that person no longer needs help, then they're feeling kind of adrift, like, well then where does that leave me? So I think that's a very interesting thing to kind of think about, where a lot of us tend to have these patterns of behavior where we're very drawn towards emotional manipulators, addicts, alcoholics, abusers who need us. It's that baby bird with a broken wing. And we feel so bad, like, well, I can't just let them suffer. I can't leave them now, right? They're now, their alcoholism is really bad, or now they've gone to jail, or they're going to be going to jail, or they're losing their children. Now they're having all these major consequences from their behavior. I can't leave them. They need me. And so we're very puppeteered by these feelings of guilt and obligation and fear. So okay, Robert Subby says codependency results from prolonged exposure to rules. And John Bradshaw says codependency is a symptom of abandonment. It's a loss of one's inner reality and an addiction to outer reality. The author's definition is a codependent is a person who can't function from his or her innate self and instead organizes thinking and behavior around a substance, a process such as money, sex, or a substance, or another person. So I think kind of what they're saying is, when we don't have a solid sense of who we are, then we're continually looking outside of ourselves and organizing our sense of self around these other people, places, or things. And that can be incredibly problematic because, people, places, and things come and go. And it's a very, you know, fragile way to live. So codependency, it's not in the DSM, which is the uh, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. It's kind of the big handbook for mental health providers. It's where different diagnoses come out of. So it's not in the DSM. It's been up for inclusion multiple times in the DSM. The closest thing that's in there to codependency is dependent personality disorder. But again, in my opinion, I think that's very different, because dependent personality disordered people, they need to be taken care of. Whereas codependent people need other people to complete them, or they need to be needed. So to me, there's a difference there. and we'll go into this here in a little bit, but I think that, and she talks a little bit about this too, but more often than not, excuse me, people that struggle with codependency will go in to a doctor or a mental health provider, and they're reporting feelings of anxiety, of depression, of mood instability. They might not have a solid sense of who they are, so maybe like a sense of emptiness or a sense of pervasive loneliness, or just kind of a loss of identity. And I think oftentimes it's diagnosed or misdiagnosed as a borderline personality disorder and anxiety and depression, which those all three of those things definitely can play into codependency, but they're not necessarily addressing like the root core of things. So, and then later stages tend to be, PTSD and, severe depression, a lot of like suicidal ideation, that kind of thing. Because if a person, and I think the reason being is if a person doesn't have a solid sense of who they are, if they can't tell a safe person or situation from an unsafe person or situation, if they're not in tune with their emotions or their intuition, then odds are they're going to continue getting tangled up and with it's a crapshoot. They're going to continue getting tangled up with problematic people or situations or career fields that are just not for them. They feel out of place in their own life. And then there's oftentimes a lot of trauma that happens because, especially if they're continuing to find themselves around abusive people, and then they're like, I don't know. And then they're already internalizing that. What's so wrong with me? Why do I keep attracting all of these abusive people? Which it's just the cycle, and it further reinforces this idea of that we're somehow not lovable, that we're not enough, and it just perpetuates this tornado of shame, really. And so there's a lot of factors at play. um and she says, it can be difficult to tell if you're codependent. And I think with any, it can be difficult to tell if a person's depressed, you know oftentimes because we're so close to it, because it's us. It's and if we've been living a certain way for any length of time, that's become our new normal. So it can be very difficult for a person to, and especially if a person's not aware that they're in emotional pain or even physical pain. Like if they're not aware of, there's not a lot of body awareness, if there's not a lot of emotional awareness, then they might, it oftentimes takes a really significant situation, like being involved with an addict or an alcoholic or a pattern of abusive people, for a person to finally do something different, go to a doctor, go to a mental health provider, and seek help. And but then at that point it can feel very re-victimizing if they start talking about codependency, because it's like, no, wait a minute, there's nothing wrong with me. The problem is my alcoholic spouse, or the problem is my abusive spouse. And that can be, it's just so difficult, because oh my gosh, there's, if a person's in the middle of an abusive relationship or they're fresh out, and having that conversation about, boundaries and standards and all of that stuff, when a person's been so incredibly victimized, it can really shut a person down, and it can contribute a lot to the shame that they're an embarrassment that they're already feeling. And also too, it tends to really minimize the huge degree of manipulation that's at play, you know? So, okay, so let's go over. So, and codependency, like anything else, is, it's on a scale ranging from like mild to moderate to severe, and the severity of it depends on a lot of different things. It depends on culture, religion, family dynamics, your experience of trauma, role models, your addictions or use of drugs, because that's going to change how you perceive reality. It's going to change how you perceive yourself. It's going to negatively impact a person's level of emotional awareness. Drug use and alcohol use, especially at a young age, tends to emotionally stunt a person, because they're not growing and learning and changing. They've been numbing out. So that can really impact a lot of things. Other factors include intimate relationships you may have had with addicts or alcoholics. And generally, symptoms show up to some extent in all of your relationships and in intimate ones to a greater degree. Although I will say for me, this was not the case. It was my friendships were more often than not the ones that were most out of balance. I had gotten tangled up with, you know, a handful of highly manipulative, awful, scary, terrible men in my life, but I also had a lot of really great relationships that I would have said were really healthy. So that didn't really surface so much there, but I had a lot of friendships that were very much like one-sided dynamics where I felt like I was a parent or a teacher or a therapist or a nurse to them and that they needed me, and I didn't need to be needed, but I felt compelled to help. I guess that's how I would have described that. But it wasn't like a peer to peer. It wasn't a relationship of equals. It was they needed me and I felt compelled to help them. And then what would tend to happen is after their crises were resolved in their life, and this was been a big aha moment for me. This was an aha moment that I would say I had within like the past year, was that things were out of alignment for me. And um like I how can I put this? That they hold on, my brain is freezing here. Like after, I don't know, because our relationship wasn't ever a friendship. It was a relationship based on crises. And so after their crises were resolved, then they didn't need me. And so and then I would get hurt because here I was thinking like, "Oh, we're friends, right? Like you know, we've gone through so much together, but really they just needed somebody to help them through whatever crises." And they never really looked at me as a friend. It was always, "Oh, well, that's Dana. She's like, a parent, a teacher, a nurse, or a therapist," kind of a thing. So there was always that unequal balance there. And then I always left having my feelings hurt, thinking, what's so wrong with me? I feel like I give and I give and I give, but yet I can't seem to keep people in my life. And um, like I had a lot of friendships that would come and go, or, a lot of, yeah, it was very painful. And that was when I realized we're not bonding over normal stuff. We're bonding over their pain, but it's very much one sided. If I was in crises or in trouble, they might give me crumbs of, oh, they'll be there for me, but it was never an equal give and take. And I was very much, I guess I was in denial about that. But if you would have asked me that a year ago, I would have said I was just really misreading the situation, which I guess was also a big part of it. So that was a big aha moment. And I also realized too that when I was dating people, that I was very quick to make my boyfriend or whoever I was with my whole world. And I think in large, oh man, there were so many things that were out of balance. And there still are. I mean, it's still a process kind of getting it in line. But I was very quick to make that guy my whole world. And so all of these kind of dysfunctional friendships that I had too were because it was never equal anyhow. And so I was feeling a lot of resentment because uh they only called me if they needed something. And I don't know. So my life really began to change when I started slowing things down with meeting new people, with friends and with men, and became very focused on being choosy instead of being chosen, and was more aware of when dynamics were one-sided and when they were more equal. And then when dating people, making sure to keep my life going, keep my friends, keep my hobbies, having healthy friendships where it's an equal give and take. And I just was missing those pieces, but it didn't. But the good news, here's the thing too, with all of us kind of getting back into alignment, is I think you will find, like I have found, that there's going to be certain pieces to this puzzle for you that are going to be a lot easier than others. And so for me, it was, there's certain like things like that, like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that I was having all these one-sided friendships and that I really needed to to get these more in alignment and, befriend different people for different reasons and bond over healthy things, not just over their trauma. And like once I had that piece of information, I was like, boom, done. Okay. And then my friendships, people I was finding in my life, like radically changed fairly quickly. And I was able to see problematic dynamics start to surface with people that were really, kind of in that whole love bombing thing. It can happen with friends too, where somebody's just coming on really intensely. They're in crisis, they need help, they need you. And I was able to really distance myself from that and kind of spin it to where I was able to be like, okay, well, you know what, here's some resources, and, you know, pointing them in a more like empowering direction. So, um, I don't know. Let's see what other people have to say in here. Okay. Karen, I like that. Karen says there was a great clip that somebody posted on the support group regarding something like, who would be your friend if all you had to offer them was you? I found that clip very eye-opening. Yes. Yes. It's interesting too with a lot of people in a lot of relationships with intimate partners, they tend to give like second chances, 20-second chances, and trying to earn this person's love and attention and loyalty and all of these things. And for me, I was doing that with friends. I wasn't doing that with men. Like if but even then, like that was, and I've talked about that before, that was still very out of alignment with me with men, because I was waiting for things to get really bad before I would leave. Like, but then again, like once I realized my boundaries really needed to be tightened up, then that was a game changer. And then that happened in a really short amount of time. So I don't know. It just a certain key pieces of information, like those little aha moments. You're like, oh, boom, like done, done. That's now that I know different, I can do different. But I think so many of us tend to walk around with this programming of what we think a relationship is supposed to be, or a friendship, or this really toxic ideas about love and commitment, and we're misreading these situations completely. And again, I think it's the vast majority of people out there. I mean, you look at movies like Twilight or 50 Shades of Grey or Beauty and the Beast, or all of these really dysfunction, Jerry Maguire, like all of these dysfunctional messages that we're getting across the board about th- you know what love is. And Beauty and the Beast, it's Stockholm Syndrome. It's all about intermittent reinforcement. And it's this idea that our love can change somebody else. And there's, there was a gal, and I've spoken about this before, who did a TED talk on love. And she was talking, people define love as, oh, it's soul crushing. It takes you from the highest highs and drops you to the lowest lows. And it's so intense. And so many romantic songs are about that type of love, but that's not love. That's not love. That's trauma bonds. That's an abusive relationship. That's an emotional roller coaster, but that's not love. Like love doesn't hurt. Love doesn't cheat. Love doesn't steal. Love doesn't abuse. Love doesn't cause mental anguish. So there's this real huge cultural misunderstanding about what love is, and what this whole blurring of boundaries and what's appropriate behavior is so pervasive within society that And that's one of the, I think, the biggest difficulties with kind of breaking out of all of this and getting your life into more of alignment is you're going to find a lot of people that don't agree with that. And you'll hear, and that the book, my book, Out of the Fog, is a lot about that, about separating out these kind of quote unquote normal ideas about love and commitment and family and all this stuff, and normal versus healthy. Because what's normal is just different shades of dysfunction, but what's healthy is completely different. And but when a person starts getting healthier, is a lot of people will say things like, "Oh, but you should really give them another chance, and I can tell that they're sorry, and you've got to love like you've never been hurt before, and you got to trust sometime," and just kind of all of these messages that can really spin a person, can knock a person off balance. I see it everywhere. I see this crap on Dr. Phil. I see it on all across YouTube with different relationship experts. And so it's not just like my peer group or like other dysfunctional people. It's people that you would think would have a more solid understanding of what's healthy, is 9 times out of 10 they don't. So, and I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I think a good way to kind of cross check yourself is to figure out, are you taking action from a place of fear, obligation, or guilt? Or are you taking action from a place of desire and empowerment? And are you taking action that you actually want to take, that's not going against your intuition? That's such a big thing. And so many of us, will look to other people for advice or validation of, hey, this situation seems problematic. What do you think? Well, if in I will tell you from personal experience, what I think is if it's registering as a problem for you, there's something that you are picking up on that's worth slowing things way down and examining. So you could tell me facts all day long, like this is what was going on and this is my trauma history, and if a person's not there, like if I'm not there in that, even if I was there, even if I was there in that situation, there's a very solid chance that you're picking up on different cues than another person is going to be picking up on. So it's so important for us to learn to turn within and to trust our judgment, and to be okay with backing up, even if you're in a room full of other people that disagree with your decision. Like it's okay to back things up to where you are feeling safe and secure and calm. So, new Chris was saying all secure, healthy people seem boring. There are uh, fun, healthy people out there. But I think that's a very common thing that a lot of people say. They're like, you know what? The intensity can be such a whirlwind because oftentimes it's not sincere. So this was something that tripped me up for a long time, is when I would hear people say, "Oh, well, it's women are so attracted to bad boys." And for me, I never was. Like that was I've always been attracted to very intelligent men. And I had to think like they didn't, ride motorcycles, and you know what I mean? Like they weren't like just had like, they were very different. Each one of them was very different, but the one thing they had in common is that they were all very intelligent. And um so I didn't understand like how that pertained to me. I'm like, what am I missing? Because I'm not attracted to bad boys. But then what I realized was I was attracted to the intensity. And oftentimes bad boys or bad girls tend to be very intense. It's that same type of kind of predatory behavior where they zero in and they make you their whole world. And the sex can be incredibly intense. The chemistry can be off the charts. It can feel like you're this soulmate. It can feel like this amazing intense connection with this other person, but it's very predatory in nature. And it's they're really appealing either consciously or subconsciously to your vulnerabilities. And so it feels so intense because we're getting all of these kind of these empty buckets filled by this person. And then the highs and lows start up, and that creates even more intensity because you've got the whole intermittent reinforcement thing going on, and trauma bonds and all kinds of chemicals, going through a person, and it's just very intense. But intensity is not sincerity, and intensity is oftentimes incredibly fleeting, and it's not real. So learning to understand the differences between love bombing and love is a huge thing, and that not all healthy people are boring, and not all boring people are healthy too. So, you know, um, and it's very common for a person after they've been tangled up with an emotional manipulator to feel like other relationships feel very flat, and for them to think, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just be attracted to like a good guy or a good girl? Why can't I just be attracted to normal? And there's there still is something to be said for chemistry. So there's a lot of people out there that are going to be good matches for you, but and not normal is not always boring. Like there can be healthy and good chemistry. And that's the zone. And that's why they also call it like the one, not, you know, one out of three women that you meet or one out of three guys that you meet. It's the one. It's a lot of sifting and sorting, you know? But it does help. It helps to know who, you know, who you are so you can better attract what you like. And for a lot of us, I think it was that Boundaries After a Pathological Relationship book by Adeline Birch. And I loved her analogy. She said, if a person doesn't have a clear sense of who they are and their identity, it's a lot like putting an octopus in or a jellyfish in no, octopus in different size jars. And that octopus is just going to take the shape of whatever jar it's in. And oftentimes that's a lot of what it is for us. If we don't really have a solid sense of who we are, then we're allowing other people to define us and other relationships to define us. So that's a really interesting point. Maria says, with the first person I experienced very healthy communication with, I felt confused. I questioned him because I was so not used to such assertive, positive communication. My baseline for normal was so low. Yes. Yeah, that's a big thing. And that's a big great way to tell if you're connecting with another person. And then that's another thing too, to have standards. Um, and it can be hard. It can be easy to get tangled up with a person who doesn't have healthy communication. And it can be easy to feel like, well, boy, I didn't know all this a few years ago. So they for sure don't know all of this. And so maybe we can grow together. But if you're encountering a bunch of like silent treatment and stonewalling and gaslighting and all kinds of nonsense and manipulation, it's important that we have our standards high enough to be like, you know what? I'm not a teacher. Like, I'm not a therapist. I'm not going to try to teach another person this stuff. Like, they need to go figure this out because all of their communication is insincere communication, and it's manipulative and it's destructive. And I'm not going to put up with that. So, they might not have learned all this stuff either, but that doesn't mean that how they're behaving is okay because, you know, like that kind of stuff is just absolute it's crazy making. And then that goes back to kind of getting clear with yourself of I'm not going to be in situations that cause me mental anguish. Period. Friendships, jobs, relationships, whatever. Like not doing that. Karen was saying, yes, I think the same. I am not naive and not codependent, but I was duped by a liar and a psychopathic narc. Yes, and Maria says, "Unhealthy communication is the mother of all red flags for me. LOL. No, no, no. I find it completely, absolutely 100% unworkable now." Yes, absolutely. I dated a guy briefly. It was just a bizarre situation, but it lasted for a few months and everything, that's how it goes, right? Like everything was really great for like the first 4 or 5 weeks. We'd kind of started off as online friends. And then we were Skyping and talking all the time. And I had disagreed with him. Actually, I didn't even, well, it wasn't even like a disagreement. I guess it was. I didn't agree with how he was handling a dangerous situation and I was concerned about him. But it wasn't like in a challenging kind of way. It was, I just disagreed with him. But I was like, hey, I don't agree with your approach, but I fully support you in whatever you decide. But if it was me, I would err on the side of caution. Well, he got so upset that he gave me silent treatment. And I brought it up and I said, you know what? I don't do silent treatment. So if you're upset with me, you can let me know. Hey, you know what? I'm really upset. I need to cool down. I'll talk to you tomorrow. But I don't do silent treatment. And so he apologized and he owned that. And then things were fine for about a week or two. And then again, things went off the rails. And it was a lot of the same kind of punishing behavior. And I was so bummed because I was like, man, this guy is so awesome in so many ways, but this is not workable, you know? And then things began to really unravel. And I'm like, I just you're starting to, I'm like, I think this guy's lying to me about a lot of things. And more red flags began to surface. And thankfully that all ended. But yes, I think it's important for us to realize, um, you know, unhealthy communication is not workable. A healthy relationship requires healthy communication. And, you know, it's, yeah. Now, that's a very good point. Vegan Yogi says, I noticed I was toxic to myself with the language I used towards myself and the way that I judged others. We pick up toxic habits and abuse ourselves. Yes. And so language, and I'll get into that here in a second, is self-talk is such a big thing. And so one of and Brene Brown in her book Daring Greatly, she talks about this, how shame for a lot of people, but especially for people that have struggle with codependency, shame is very much an internalized feeling. Whereas a person with healthy self-esteem might say something like they might make a mistake and they might think to themselves, oh, you know, like, man, I really messed up. I did something bad. Versus a person who's internalizing it might tell themselves, I am bad. I am a failure. I am a mistake. And they wear that like a coat. And that's a very, very sad, hard way to live if we're feeling, that we're somehow broken, flawed, damaged, not worthy. And a lot of those feelings of unworthiness, of feeling unloved and unimportant and unworthy and all of that stuff, it most likely it's not at our conscious level of awareness. If we've been feeling this way for a really long time, then it just might be how kind of our default, right? Of like, that's just how I feel. And so it can take a little while to kind of do some examining and think about, okay, am I walking, do I feel worthy? Do I feel worthy of being treated with dignity and respect? These are basic human rights. These are rights that we give prisoners. So, other people, you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. It's not something that you should have to earn. And a lot of abusive people out there will say, like, oh, well, respect is earned. And they'll want to argue that point. If you just acted better, I'd respect you. There's a difference between respecting a person and like treating them respectfully. So, like, I might, not respect a person that I don't know, but I'm still going to treat them with respect. I'm still going to treat them respectfully. And like abusive people, that mindset, like that's gets tangled up in there and they don't understand that. So, um, I just wanted to clarify that. You don't need to earn being treated with dignity and respect. That's ridiculous. Uh, okay, so part of the recovery process from codependency includes healthy self-esteem, awareness of feelings and needs, becoming more creative and spontaneous. So basically being yourself on a moment to moment, day by day basis, practicing self-care, having interdependent relationships. I'll cover that here in a second. Assertive communication, intact, flexible boundaries, and feeling empowered and pursuing goals. So, there's a few things I want to touch on here. So, interdependent relationships. So there's dependent, right? Where like we need somebody else to take care of us. And then there's independent, which is I don't need anybody. Like I'm fine, I'm good. And then there's interdependent of, I can handle my own and you can handle your own. And we've got two whole people coming together and being in a whole healthy relationship. And it's more based out of I really want you in my life. Like I appreciate you. It's coming from a place of abundance. I'm not looking for you to heal me or teach me or fix me. I I enjoy then when a person they're already feeling whole. I know how to make myself happy. I already feel loved. Then they can go to a relationship and they can actually give. And then there's that synergy there where that relationship becomes a very nourishing place for both people versus coming there from a place of scarcity of I don't feel loved, I don't feel validated, I need you to let me know that I'm okay. And that place of need, of I need you, it's very draining for both people involved. And um, you know, And then, of course, too, it's even more exhausting if a codependent person's in a relationship with a narcissist, because then the narcissist is taking, 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 and the codependent person is continuing to give with the mindset if I give enough, then eventually I'll get from them. I'll get their love, their loyalty, their trust, I'll get some sort of need met in return, and that never ever happens. And so it's just like pouring all of our time and energy and emotions into a black hole that is this narcissist that just sucks it all up. And then, we have nothing left to give. And then we just become a shell of a person. And then oftentimes they move on because it's all about them all the time. And they're also kind of this hungry ghost or like a vampire, like a true vampire. They'll drain one person completely, but their thirst remains. Then they need to go find another person to completely drain, and then another person, and then another person. So we can't give enough because their thirst is perpetual because they use other people to meet their needs instead of meeting their needs on their own. Uh, okay. So that's interdependent relationships is a big thing. Making that vow of, I'm going to start working towards having a relationship that's based off of two equal people coming together instead of these one-sided dynamics where I'm feeling the need to save somebody else. I'm sinking myself to save them with the intention of keeping the relationship afloat. Like that's toxic, very unhealthy. So some early stages of codependency. Early stages tend to be being attracted to a needy person, offering help, gifts, meals. Recovery from this involves basically hitting a rock bottom, getting tired of this and reaching out for help for ourselves, being like, I can't do this all. Early stage involves attempting to people please and to make them happy. And recovery involves, getting things more in alignment and realizing kind of what we have control over and what we don't have control over. Learning boundaries, learning to say no, learning to be assertive. Early stages involved being obsessed with this other person and their behavior, Recovery involves focusing on our own behavior, and that is such a huge thing. And so this is one of the shifts that I've been really trying to make with the channel too. And um, is it's norm when a person goes through anything traumatic, especially with an emotional manipulator. So many of us, if we've never encountered anything like that before, it's it really is like encountering like a demon or something that's not human. And it's so we did not know that these people walked the earth, or if we did know, we thought for sure we'd be able to spot them. And so there's this period in healing where a person goes through all of this info gathering where they're trying to understand what happened, and they're very fixated on understanding narcissism and sociopathy and psychopathy and borderline personality disorder and all of these things, trying to make sense of what caused them pain so they can avoid it again in the future. Makes total sense. That's a very important part of healing, to realize that it's not you, that there are people like this that walk the earth that don't have empathy or remorse, and that are highly manipulative and can cause a boatload of damage. So, and for those that have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, please know not all people with borderline personality disorder cause that amount of damage, but some do. So, just saying. But so it's very normal for a person to really focus on this. They become very upset about it. They really want to shout, or they want to warn other people. They want to shout about this from the rooftops. And then down the road, because again, it can be very hard to see, especially if we've never had this happen before. Like, when somebody points out to us about boundaries or standards, a person can become very defensive, understandably so, and feel like, hey, you know what? I didn't do anything wrong. Like, I got tangled up with an emotional con artist who pretended to be the love of my life and then swindled me out of my life savings. And I didn't even realize that this happened. You know, like, how could I have seen this? And, and in my case, I spent many years actively trying to figure out, like, what was my part in this? Please, I need to figure this out because I don't want this to happen again. And um the only thing that I could hold on to in my situation was I didn't honor my intuition. I mean, everything else, there were minor pieces, and it was like a fairy tale. It was too good to be true, both times. So, not every abusive situation actually turns into overt abuse. Sometimes there's just a lot of manipulation and a lot of, um, stuff that you don't see that goes on. So, but anyways, a lot of people will tend to get very fixated on understanding narcissism and sociopathy. And so for me, I didn't realize that I had weak boundaries. And it seriously took me like 6 years to realize this. And not that that would have prevented me from getting tangled up with Jack and Steve, to be honest. I really don't think that that had anything to do with it. What would have helped prevent that for me was to honor my intuition both times and to not gloss over those early red flags. But um so I didn't see my part in things. I didn't think that I had weak boundaries. And I think from the aha moment was I realizing I had a lot of one-sided dynamics with friends. And then that was kind of like pulling that string on that sweater, and then realizing, "Oh my goodness, like, yes, that's it." And so then things began to make a lot more sense, because I feel like I had assertive communication with men, and I had a sort of communication with Jack and Steve, and I thought we had this amazingly healthy relationships. So I was very, especially with Jack, I was very caught off guard by how crazy things got at the end, and all of the deceit and all of the lies, and that I think he was, trying to poison me, and like just how crazy things got, and how I didn't I didn't pick up on any of that, you know? So, oh, I don't know. That's a whole that still messes with my head when I think about it too much. But focusing on us. So very some here's some common situations that in questions people tend to have, and I totally get it. I really do. Well, they will say, "Well, I'm not sure if this person is really a narcissist or if, they're just kind of narcissistic." Or like, is this really a problem? Like, is this really abusive or is this just kind of a problem and I'm making a big deal out of it? And instead, when we can make ourselves nuts trying to figure out, are they a narcissist? Are they a sociopath? And what are they doing? And, you know, r- really trying to sort all that out. And that can get a person kind of lost in the weeds. It's a lot easier to put the focus back on you and figure out, okay, where are your standards? Where are your lines in the sand? And if your line in the sand is, you know what, I don't do perpetual confusion in relationships and I don't do mental anguish. So if things start to get to that point, or crazy making is another good one, then I'm out. I don't care if it's me. I don't care if it's them. I don't care if it's us. I don't have these dynamics with the vast majority of other people in my life. It's only with certain people. And I need to just get out, back things way up, or just get out of these dynamics because it's odds are it's not you. If you don't have these types of dynamics with your coworkers, with a lot of other people in your life, it just tends to be certain people. Then it's there's um whatever is going on, it's not healthy and it's not worth your mental health. So focusing on where are your lines in the sand with things and making it about you and not about them. Uh, okay, so another part, early signs, rationalizes and doubts their own perceptions. So this is another big one that we talk about a lot. And it's because if a person's not really grounded within themselves, then if they're looking for, they don't trust their judgment and their perceptions of events, and they're looking to other people for that validation. And odds are that's continually steering them wrong because other people are not picking up on the same things that you're picking up. Um, And if you find yourself in, toxic situation after toxic situation, and everybody else is telling you, hey, there's no problem. It's, probably just due to your past, but this pattern keeps repeating, it's going to cause a person to be really confused and to feel like, what am I doing wrong? How do I keep winding up here? But things will begin to change when you can focus more on you, to be like, okay, I trust my perceptions of things. Even if I'm confused by them, I realize I trust that confusion is not normal. And so I need to back things up to the point where I don't feel confused, that I feel like I can breathe, I am relaxed, and that I can see situations clearly. And so, and that takes practice. And every single time a person experience, myself included, every single time you feel confused about a situation, you're going to feel knocked off balance, and it's going to spin you into introspection. Is it them or is it me? Can I just not take a joke? Is it because of my past? Am I too sensitive? Is this weird? Does this seem dangerous? But I will tell you, think about the stuff that you're asking, because like in a normal situation, most people don't wonder wonder about, they don't wonder about things like that. If you find like you're constant, you odds are you don't ask yourself, am I being too sensitive around them? Am I wondering if they're going to hurt me? Am I wondering if they're dangerous? Like, we don't have those feelings around safe people. It's only unsafe people that we feel unsafe around. So, okay, so another part of early stages, giving up activities to be with this person, your family and social life is affected, increasingly emotionally dependent. And a lot of when these relationships start up, because we're talking about the level of intensity, right? And so if a person's already feeling very empty and like they need somebody else to complete them, and here comes this emotional manipulator, and they tend to, this level of intensity starts to kick up this emotional whirlwind, and the codependent person's like very quick to want to jump into that whirlwind of, oh my God, this feels so amazing. They feel so perfect. They're my soulmate. I just, and here's the thing too, if another person feels perfect to you, that's a really great sign that you're not seeing the situation clearly, because nobody's perfect. So that's the oxytocin and the dopamine talking. Like, that's not the reality of the situation. It takes a while to know a person. And during those first 90 days or so, things feel amazing. People are really in sync. They're really clicking. It really feels like, man, this is the one. This time things are going to be different. But then once all those chemicals, that chemical induced haze that we call, well, it's really lust is what it is. Once that settles down and then the reality starts surfacing, for both people, they're like, boy, this person's changed. And odds are they haven't changed. We're just now starting to actually meet them, because who we've been interacting with before is like their highest and best version of themselves. It's their self with makeup on, and who's on their best behavior, and who's trying to be sexy, and who's trying to be funny, and who's trying to be entertaining, and who's trying to be likable and agreeable. And there's kind of that whole, like, that mating dance that happens the first, you know, 30 to 90 days, but then people get comfortable. And with an emotional manipulator, that's when these cracks really start showing. So, point being is, go slow, because everybody can look great to begin with. Okay, so middle stages of codependency. This is oftentimes goes along with when things start to take a turn and the devalue stage starts surfacing. Is there's often this denial and minimization of painful aspects of the relationship, hiding painful aspects of the relationship from other people. Anxiety, guilt, and self blame increases. Self esteem lessens. A person tends to withdraw from family and friends, and tries to control them by nagging, blaming, and manipulation. And I will say, with manipulation, with as far as codependency is concerned, it tends to be ingratiating type behavior. Like, well, if I just walk on enough eggshells, if I can just focus on keeping you happy, then maybe you'll go back to the way that you were. And if I can be good to you, then you'll be good to me. And that's how that cycle of, well, maybe I'll just be better to be treated better. And it's that feeling of like, well, if I can just earn it. But that's really, really not healthy, and it doesn't work. So, uh, and two, there's some parts of codependency that frankly, I do feel that are very blurred with narcissism. Um, and I don't know if I have this in my notes this time around, but I'll see if I come across them, I'll bring them up. Okay, anger and disappointment due to broken promises grows. Feeling of resentment at inability to control the person, and again, that can sound very like narcissistic or very controlling, but I think it's more in the sense of trying to get the relationship back to the way that it was. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where there's so much manipulation that goes on in an abusive relationship, that it's and there's all of that intermittent reinforcement, where the person that's on the receiving end of this is like, if you've never experienced anything like this before, of course a person's going to use like their previous patterns for understanding relationships in order to try to make this current relationship work, but those things don't line up. And so, you know, it's it's just so confusing. You're like, well, wait a minute, everything was fine, and now all of a sudden I disagree. I disagree with you about the president or about what to have for dinner, and you fly into a rage or you shove me. But then the abusive person's now blaming you, like, you're whatever, like, you're so I don't know, you're so emotional, you're such a woman, here you are, you're so forgetful, you're so this, you're so that. And so the person on the receiving end of that might feel like, maybe I am. Like maybe I am to blame for their behavior. And then it's just the confusion ensues and the eggshells, people start to walk on eggshells, and people kind of make a mental note. Okay, note to self, like don't discuss politics. Note to self, don't ever forget to buy anything at the store again. Note to self, don't like. But the thing is, with an abusive person, is there's never enough things that we can do to get to earn to try to control the abuse. We didn't cause it and we can't control it. All we can do is distance ourselves from it, because we can't control another person. We can only control ourselves. And but when a person's in the thick of that, they feel responsible for it, because the abusive person's very adamant that, hey, I wouldn't have yelled at you had you, not done X, Y, and Z. So it messes with the person's mind on like epic proportions. Yes, Alcuda Babe says they don't like it when your perception differs from theirs, because 9 times out of 10 they want you to agree with them. Yes. And it's very much too that because for a narcissist it's all about them. And so they have, in the book, I think it's The Verbally Abusive Relationship, she does such a fantastic job of describing how she thinks that abusive people look at their targets, and I would agree completely. So she uses the analogy of it's like a child that has a teddy bear, and in their mind, their teddy bear has no autonomy outside of them. Like, this teddy bear belongs to me, and this teddy bear has these thoughts and these feelings, and this personality that the child has created, right? But as a person grows older, like, normal people with like normal development patterns understand that other people are individuals, and that they have their own thoughts and feelings and opinions, and that they're going to differ from theirs. But with narcissists, there's often such a high degree of like emotional a lack there's such a lack of emotional awareness of their own stuff and of other people. And um so they really feel like, okay, well, this is my wife, my girlfriend, my or boyfriend or whatever, my child, whatever, and they should act a certain way, because it's all about, they're a reflection of me. So if I'm a certain religion, if I have certain opinions, if I and then often here's where it gets really crazy, is then there's this high degree of like, well, then you should also be a mind reader. You want to cook pizza in July, and oh god, it's so crazy. So like it could be a Friday night, and you're like, "Hey, you make pizza," and then they get upset because you had the oven on and it's July and it's 100 degrees outside. And they're like, "Oh, you should know. What are you doing now? The house is so hot and I can't. God, you're so stupid." And they get so upset. And a person can feel like, okay, there's like a kernel of truth to that. Like, yeah, it's really hot outside, but I thought we would have pizza and a movie. But then next week, if they're in the mood for pizza, then they could be like, "Hey, why don't you go make pizza? We're going to have pizza and a movie." And then it's crazy making, because it's like, well, wait a minute. I thought we weren't going to like turn the oven on because it's July, but now it's okay. And now I'm an idiot for not knowing it's okay. Like, you can't even anticipate, because their reality shifts based on, oh, I got to plug in my laptop, based on how they're feeling in that moment. And that's so the people around them are trying to constantly kind of hit this moving target of, guess what, guess what this controlling person thinks or feels, or what mood they're in. And so that's a very difficult way for other people to live, and it's impossible, because what's okay one day might not be okay the next day. And then they'll look at you like you're from Mars, Like, oh, of course you should know this, right? Like you should know why it was not okay last week, but now it's okay this week. It's an exercise. It's crazy making. That's why I said it's just when you're dealing with somebody that's crazy making, it's just you're better off just, I don't know, in my opinion, getting, I don't play that game. So it's exhausting. And it doesn't matter if they know that they're doing it or not, you know? So because it is exhausting. So, and then here's the thing too. So if a person, so like with individuality, so if a person is showing their individuality, and let's say, you're like, wow, I really want to go to yoga and I want to go join this book club and I want to do all these things, and they don't see that there's, well, why would you want to do that? And that's stupid. And I don't like yoga. And you know, so if a person if they're codependent and they're going to stay in this relationship in order to keep the peace, what tends to happen is then they slowly start grinding, the abusive person, the controlling person starts grinding down the sides of their target that they don't like. And the codependent person will oftentimes help them, thinking, okay, well, I'll just find, and this can often fly under the radar of, well, I'm just really go with the flow. I'm just being accommodating. It takes two people to make a relationship work. You know, he's not okay with me going to yoga. I'll just, you know what? It's okay. I'll just go to Zumba instead. And, she's not okay with me, you know, dyeing my hair black, and I guess it is a little bit dark, and so I'll just go lighter. It's just not a big deal. It's not a big deal. Don't worry about me. Like that's kind of the typical, I'm just going to keep the peace. I'm just going to keep the peace, and in order to keep the peace, I'm going to start sacrifice. I'm going to start carving off parts of myself is what ends up happening. But and I speak from personal experience with this. So when a person starts doing this and they're continually putting themselves in the back burner, there comes a time where they're so out of tune with their wants and their needs and their thoughts and their feelings, because they've really had to kind of accommodate all of those things around a controlling person in their life, either as a parent or in um, that they had when they were a child, or as a partner, that they really lose the sense of identity, if they ever even had a solid sense of identity to begin with. And so later on in life, when a person if a person finds themselves in an abusive relationship, and then afterwards they feel so incredibly blown apart and they're like, I don't even know where to begin. I don't even know who I am. I don't know if I ever knew who I am, who I was, and I don't know how to start. Like I don't even know what to do. It can feel so incredibly overwhelming. And so getting reconnected with yourself and figuring these things out is a big part of healing. So um, she gives a lot of exercises in the book in the second half, kind of about um, tons of questions to ask, which are fantastic. So okay, so here's what somebody had mentioned earlier. Do codependent people start acting like narcissists? So late stages of codependency often include, developing physical symptoms, anxiety, depression, anger, um, this resentment, this grinding down, this loss of self, this feeling of I'm keep trying to earn your love, your approval, your validation, and you're not giving it to me. It it can make a person sick, you know, lupus, MS, fibromyalgia, probably cancer, all different kinds of disorders can come from the chronic pain, insomnia, all of the arthritis, um, you know, all kinds of different diseases and disorders can stem from being in a really toxic environment for a long time. A person feeling angry, hopeless, depressed, developing addictions, developing obsessive compulsive behavior, a further decline in self esteem, despair, and lack of self care. So, addictions, I would say addictions and actually cheating is very common too. And it's a way for, it's oftentimes both of these things are coping. It's a way like, okay, I can't leave this situation, but I'm not getting my needs met. And so I'm going to start coping in the best ways that I know how, whether that's through alcohol, through prescription pain meds, which a lot of people do because they justify it thinking like, well, but I've got a prescription for it. Um, harder drug use, trying to get that attention and that validation in other ways, finding themselves cheating, and there's oftentimes a lot of like self-loathing and anger that goes along with it of, I don't want to be cheating, but like it can feel so nice to be wanted by somebody. Whereas with a narcissist, it's never enough. So they can get tangled up in affairs that they might not have ever had otherwise. Uh, okay, increased conflicts. So this is where oftentimes like a lot of if a person's with an abusive person who's lying, who's cheating, who's stealing, who's manipulating, then reactive abuse starts happening where they start fighting back. And whereas before they were starting to buy all of the excuses and the lies, oh, this other person, this woman or this other guy or whoever, oh, they mean nothing. They're just a friend. You're paranoid, you're jealous, you're possessive, you've got the problem, you're bipolar, or you need to go to a therapist, but the whole time this emotional manipulator's either planting seeds of jealousy, trying to provoke an emotion, or they're cheating, but then they're just gaslighting their way out of it or out of the accountability for it. And then finally, the person's just had enough. They're like, I've had, it's all of the mental anguish and the crazy making and the gaslighting and all of this that they start fighting back. And so then this can really escalate into physical fights where, and rage attacks from the person that's been on the receiving end of all of the cheating and the lies and the abuse. And then things can get really confusing for them and for the police and for other people because now both people in the relationship are physically abusive and they're emotionally abusive to each other. But for that codependent person, it's they still don't want to leave. They just want their partner to stop cheating or to stop verbally abusing them or to stop, whatever. But the piece that the codependent partner is missing is that, there's abusive people in this world and that's just who they are, like that they're not going to stop. And so us confronting them and threatening them and making demands and catching them in the act and showing proof and doing all of this stuff and dragging them to therapy or having them go to jail for domestic violence, this stuff doesn't change them. Like some people are just rotten, like they're just kind of rotten to the core. I know it sounds really terrible and maybe harsh to say, but I was thinking about earlier too. I think it was Henry Cloud who talked about, he refers to a lot of personality disordered people as character disordered. And I really like that but I think it needs to be even more of a distinction because I think there's a difference between being personality disordered and then being character disordered. Because some people can have disorders within their personality that make it very difficult for them to engage in meaningful relationships, right? Um, However, character disordered people, they lack a moral compass. And for normal, decent people, it's very hard for us to understand that there's other people that walk the earth that just don't have a moral compass. And it takes years, if not decades, for that to actually compute, and again for a whole wide variety of reasons because other people are, they're going to their church and their church leaders are like, we commitments forever and you got to work on things, and I can tell they're really sorry, they're crying, or they really want to make it work. And so there's all of these outside influences keeping these people together, or I should say keeping the target in the manipulationship. And um and the normal decent people oftentimes because there's also this pattern of these highs and lows, and so they think, well, maybe this time we've actually turned a corner. They seem to be real on really great behavior. Our therapist is just absolutely thrilled by how much progress we've made. I've heard this from multiple friends of mine who I'm like, you're being cheated on right and left. I don't. Oh, it's just so frustrating, you know. So, um, their partner's, on their best behavior, and then boom, 5 years later, they found out, "Oh, actually, no, he's gotten 3 other girls pregnant," and there's just this whole trail of tears that they leave behind them. So, it's difficult for normal people to see this stuff. Michael says, "Dana, when you stand your ground with a narcissist, it draws a line saying the start of the end of the abuse." Yes, absolutely, and if they, um drawing that line and then kind of getting clear with yourself of, okay, how many times and how many, and this is what can be tricky too, because it can be drawing a line in one area, like the example I was giving earlier with, okay, silent treatment, like I don't do silent treatment, so don't do that again. But with an emotional manipulator, it's that game like whack-a-mole. Like you might have one situation addressed and then boom, another one pops up, and it's like, okay, I don't like you're continually addressing issues, and then it's just crazy making. So I think it's important for everybody to have this idea of at what point, how many times am I going to bring stuff up before I do finally just walk away? And I'm like, I'm not playing this game. I don't like feeling nervous and anxious and unhinged and in this way. So, okay, it looks like there's some stuff going on in the chat, and it's so hard for me to see what's going on in here and think and talk at the same time. Okay, I'll have to see if I can read through this chat later and get caught up with stuff. So, okay, let me get back to my notes here. Okay, so recovery. She lists out 4 steps for recovery. Number 1, building self-awareness. So, to build self-awareness, gaining information is a big part of that. And the more information a person has, the easier it is. She calls it coming out of denial, but I think it's really less about coming out of denial and more about things being, I guess it's the same. Maybe it's the other side of that coin. Less about coming out of denial, more about things being brought into our awareness. So, okay, number 2, healing your relationship with yourself. Get to know yourself, heal shame and past wounds, build self-esteem and find pleasure, developing hobbies, for example. So that's a big, big piece to this is really getting reconnected with yourself. I'd mentioned many times in that whole kind of emotional scale of tuning in on ranking things from 0 to 10, 10 being what feels really good for you emotionally, physically, spiritually, what have you, 5 that feels lukewarm, and then 0 that's ice cold. And whether that's with and across the board with people, places, things, experiences, events, situations, and being honest with yourself when you start getting ranking things in your life. And it's not from a place of judgment, it's from a place of kind of introspection and what you want in your life. Okay. So, okay, number 3, healing your relationship with others. Letting go of focusing on others, learning to be assertive, establishing boundaries, and having healthy relationships. And so the big part of letting go of focusing on others, that can be so incredibly difficult to do if a person, if they are married to a person who's an addict or an alcoholic or abusive. And there is this high degree of emotional investment in a situation. And, um, there's this high degree of emotional investment in a situation. There's a high degree of financial investment. Um, and it can be very difficult because for the person on the receiving end of it, they're like, my life is unbearable. I'm married to an alcoholic or an addict or an abusive person. I need to get them to change because my life, their behavior is negatively impacting me. So I need to get them to change. And it can take a person a long time to realize that we don't have control over other people. All we have control over is the boundaries that we try to set in order to limit the damage done by their behavior. But where these things can become so, where this can become really difficult is setting boundaries with an abusive person can become very dangerous very quickly. And that's even assuming that a person can see these things clearly for what they are, because when a person's being so manipulated in a situation, it can be very difficult for them to even realize that they are being manipulated. Okay, Mia asks, Dana, can you address the anger and the aftermath? Anger is a very normal, healthy response to a very abnormal, unhealthy situation. And it can be incredibly painful and difficult to experience such a degree of anger. Um, Most people are like, I've never felt this angry before in my life. Like it's rage, and they just feel like it's like a fire hose that's just spraying everywhere, and like I can't even control it. It's just seeping out of my pores. I am so freaking angry, and I'm a live wire. And very normal, very natural, very understandable. And um, it's righteous anger, it's valid anger, but it's one of those things that it can anger can there's so much energy in anger. And I found personally that it really can help to try to direct that energy into a positive direction. So and doing so helps the person really reclaim the power and control over their life. And this takes practice, and it's something that I encourage people to do on like a regular basis. So because they're in and here's something too. So people will say, "Oh, but if you're not allowing yourself to feel the emotion, then like you're not actually working through it." But I think when a person is having so much anger that it's actually rage and they're feeling so out of control, then they're not at a place that they can actually sit with that emotion and effectively work through it. Like they're at such a volatile place. So I would encourage a person if they're feeling that extreme to just try to get that energy out in the most constructive ways possible. There will be plenty of time for when more manageable degrees of anger surface, that a person can sit with that and process that and kind of work through it. But it's very difficult when things are kind of at that fever pitch of emotions. So, but doing any little things. So burning that energy off. So going to the gym, going running, going for a walk, making the conscious concerted effort to transmute all of that those bad feelings into good feelings. and making the declaration that you're just not going to let this person destroy your life. And so if you're feeling really hateful, a way to kind of slow down and change that emotion is to shift into feeling grateful. So I had to really get stubborn about this because it's not something that's intuitive and it's not something that you're going to feel like you want to do. So if you're feeling so full of anger and venom and just rage, to slow down and just be like, okay, 10 things that I'm grateful for and start listing them off. Or deciding, being like, I'm not going to let this ruin my life. I'm not going to let this person steal my happiness or my joy. And then go spending quality time with your child or quality time with your pet or doing something nourishing for you, eating a big salad, going for a run, drinking a green smoothie, and just being like, damn it, I'm going to make this healthy. I'm going to make this work for me. I'm not going to let this ruin my life. And like I said, you're not gonna feel like doing that, but it's like doing bicep curls for your brain, for your emotions. So, Della asks, "What if you don't have anger? What is the inner problem not having it, and how can you find it?" And Postmodern says, "I would say you are lucky." Uh, and Alcuda Babe says, "Della, do you know what you are feeling?" So, oftentimes, there's a saying out there that anger is the bodyguard to hurt. And there's a lot of truth to that. And so if for a lot of people that that have been kind of taught that their anger is not acceptable for whatever reason, whether that's cultural, whether that's gender based, whether that's just the household that they grew up in, where let's say if mom was a rageaholic and would just yelled at everybody, but everybody kind of knew like, okay, mom yells, but we're not allowed to ever get angry about it or have a bad day. We've all learned we're just going to walk on eggshells. Then as an adult, a person's going to be really out of tune with allowing themselves to feel angry. And so instead they just shut down. So numbness is oftentimes a substitute for anger for a lot of people. Uh, some things that you could do to kind of almost like milk that emotion, creating playlists, like really high energy, kind of, you know, like angry, Rage Against the Machine, Metallica, like intense kind of, yeah, yeah, like getting riled up kind of music where you start feeling those feelings of anger and rage, and then directing it in a more constructive way. So like going for a walk, going for a run on the treadmill, lifting weights, kind of crying, doing whatever feels natural to just kind of flush that emotion out is a big thing. Michael says cardio. Yeah, cardio is big. Karen says, I've also heard that depression is anger turned inward. Yes, I stopped the cyclical depression when I started turning it outward and actually dealing with it in a positive way. And so, um, yes, and I think it's depression is oftentimes a lot of hurt turned inward, and it's a lot of um, irritation and resentment turned inward. If a person is not allowed to be themselves, and most people are not. I mean, I would say the vast majority of the time, people are not. Most this whole concept of like self-awareness and self-actualization and building self-esteem and kind of this conscious parenting, this is very very new stuff. And it's been kind of an evolution, I would say, since probably like the 60s or 70s, but I would say that we're just really just now kind of on the cutting edge of this. So, before, if a person had a child back in, the 1900s, it was very much like, "Oh, good, we have somebody else to help us on the farm." Like, you didn't have options. Like, if your father was a farmer, you were a farmer. If your father was an attorney, you were attorney. Like, people had children for their own reasons. Like, and a lot of people still have children for their own reasons. You know, like, okay, I'm having a child because I want somebody to take care of me when I'm old, or I'm having a child because I'm lonely, or because I want to feel loved, or whatever reason. But that mindset right there sets that child up to fail, because there's all these expectations put upon them from the get, instead of realizing that these totally unique individuals are we're bringing these individuals into the world. They're going to have their own thoughts and feelings and opinions and emotions and an individual self. And so I think we're just kind of now at that understanding of seeing children as individuals. But it's that, I would imagine, a very hard line for parents to walk, because a child is also, they're born into that family system, they're born into culture and that religion and all these other things that help to shape that child consciously and subconsciously, into fitting in to those different systems. And so, um but a big part of that is, as an adult, going back and kind of figuring out, stripping back these layers, and like, what do I agree with? And do I agree with the religion that I was raised in? And is this something that resonates with me? And how about these other messages I had about kind of ideas about men and women and marriage, and um, you know, what's possible for me, and career paths and education and all of these things. And so it takes a person a while to kind of figure out, well, who am I? And so, such a big part of all of this recovering from codependency, understanding, um, you know, getting back into alignment with ourselves, which is really the core of all of this, getting back into alignment with ourselves, being able to meet our own needs effectively, and be able to figure out who we are as an individual, and then be able to actually like express that and live that. That's what it means to live an authentic life. But it's difficult. Like, it's really difficult to strip away all of that muck that's on top of us. So, okay, let me scroll down here. And I'll be posting a lot of this on my website here in the next week or so. Okay, so here's another big part of it. So, self-esteem. Self-esteem reflects how you feel about yourself. Replacing shame and low self-esteem with self-respect and self-worth is the cornerstone to recovery. Yes, and it's one of the biggest building blocks to rediscovering yourself. So, realizing that you matter, that you're worthy of being treated with dignity and respect, learning what that means to be treated that way by others, what it means for us to treat ourselves that way, and then living that. So, confronting negative self talk, like we were talking about earlier, affirmations can be fantastic for this. Uh, but a big part of it is learning to even hear that negative self talk. Because again, if we've been at this for 40 years and we've been telling ourselves all kinds of garbage talk, we might not even realize that we have negative self talk. So, slowing things down and paying attention and asking yourself, you know, if we're telling ourselves, oh man, I'm so stupid, I can't believe I did that, geez, when are you ever going to learn? Asking yourself, if I would I ever talk to somebody that I loved like that? Hopefully the answer is no, you know? So, thinking of yourselves in terms of like your inner child. Would I ever talk to a child like that? Probably, hopefully not. So then it's not okay for me to talk to me like that. If I really love myself, I'm going to acknowledge you're going to make mistakes, things are going to happen, but to acknowledge it and address it, kind of develop a plan of action, and then reaffirm yourself. You know what? Yeah, you messed up. You bounced the check, or you got to work late, or what have you, but you know what? Okay, so we're going to do better next time, and we're going to leave the house 20 minutes earlier. We got to start doing this, because you don't like to feel so frazzled and speeding to work, and you know then you're all frazzled. It's not working, so let's do something different. Or you bounce the check, and okay, you know what? Sometimes it happens. This is a sign. This is a sign that we need to pay more attention. Maybe we need to start, going to online banking and reviewing our account every Friday. Pick a day of the week that you're going to catch up on everything. And like, you develop a plan and you kind of figure out, okay, let's problem solve this so this doesn't keep happening, versus just being like, I'm stupid. I'm no good with money. I should have known better. You know, and just that kind of collapsing into that shame. So being kind to yourself, taking responsibility for your actions, affirming yourself, accepting yourself, reducing guilt, and forgiving yourself. That forgiving yourself is an ongoing big one, I have found. Meeting your needs. So when like we were talking about earlier, so when you can meet your needs, then you're looking towards other people to from a place of want, instead of like that desperate clinging like need. Like, I need you in my life to complete me. It's like, no, my life's good. Like, I love my life. I love everything about it. I would love to have you in my life, but I don't desperately need you there, right? Kind of a difference. Uh Sharing feelings appropriately, that's a big one. Trusting and loving yourself. So sharing feelings appropriately, opening up slowly, just taking things slow in general, realizing that it's not healthy to be an open book, and um, that nobody needs to know every single thing about you. You don't need to have conversations that make you uncomfortable. You don't need to tell another person everything about you, even your spouse. Like, it's okay. It's okay to not to have certain things that you don't share with other people, certain thoughts or certain feelings that if you're not comfortable sharing them, that you don't need to. Uh so okay, hold on a second. Okay, that's a good point. So Healthy Love says, talking about gossip. Gossip is the worst. I know that it's easier for people to gossip or complain instead of dealing with codependency. And so what I have found with gossip is a really big sign that we're unable to be assertive. Because if somebody violates a boundary with us, and if we're not able, for whatever reason, willing or able to confront them, then it's going to remain an issue. Sort of like the saying goes that when people talk about, oh, old issues keep being brought up, the reality is old issues don't keep being brought up, unresolved issues do. And so if a person's continuing, if your boss you've got a coworker that did something to you, and you're like, man, I'm really just chapped that she did that. And instead of addressing it directly with her, then going to somebody else and addressing it with them, or coming home and talking to your spouse about it. This is very, very common. What we can glean from that is, if we're talking to other people about a situation, it's generally because it's been unresolved with that person. And the more we can practice assertive behavior, and this goes for me too, the more we can practice assertive behavior, the less that kind of stuff happens. And the more we practice being assertive, the more natural it becomes. And it just things oftentimes become a non-issue, because we're nipping them in the bud before they become a major issue. So gossip is a great way to pay attention to, like, okay, am I finding myself gossiping about somebody or talking about another person Odds are it's because I have an unresolved issue with them. And odds are it's because they've crossed a boundary and I need to get that boundary back into alignment. And what all needs to happen in that situation. Because sometimes that boundary is able to be rectified and sometimes it's not. Sometimes the only way we can correct that boundary is to go no contact. And speaking of which, I think that's a lot of the reason people oftentimes feel the need to continue to talk and talk and talk and talk and talk about how they've been so violated in this abusive relationship is not only are they trying to make sense of it, they need to feel heard because they can't go back to that other person and get closure. So there's a ton of unresolved stuff. And the more they learn about manipulation and about um, abuse, and the more they're starting to realize that they're not crazy, they start seeing what's going on, then they're needing to process it. They're needing to actually work through that. But because they can't work through it with the abusive person because it just leads to more abuse, they need to get that poison out of their system somehow. So it's just interesting when we can start looking at our own uh you know, I well, sorry, I'm getting caught up with stuff with the chat. Um Lost my train of thought. Okay. Let's see. Did I go through this? I think I did. Oh, what I was going to say is examining our behavior and thinking about why are we doing what we're doing? Because it all leaves clues. That's what's so interesting about all this. So, okay, so she talks too about healthy communication, developing healthy communication. This is so huge, and it's definitely all of this stuff is a practice. It takes practice. There's no shortcuts here. So being direct and honest, getting comfortable with the truth takes practice. And a lot of people are not comfortable with the truth, even on very small in small ways. So let alone big ways. And again, that's where the triangulation comes from, gaslighting comes from, like all of this toxic communication is when people are not okay with the truth and they start trying to deflect and deny reality and rewrite reality, then it's just crazy making for other people when, and it's difficult. And a lot of people are uncomfortable having assertive communication because it can be uncomfortable to talk about an issue head on. It's much easier to just to pretend like, oh, it's not a big deal and I'll just go with the flow and it's okay and totally no big deal when it actually is a big deal. And especially if we grew up with a family, you know, if we grew up in a family where we weren't allowed to express our emotions, and again, most children in general are not. A lot of families have kind of this mentality of you're a kid, you do what I say, and you're not allowed to argue. You need to eat your vegetables. I don't care if you like them. You need to. Oh, I think it was in that book, The Verbally Abusive Relationship. That was such a big aha moment for me. She was talking about kind of the ways that children start to get separated from their authentic self, and it happens in like little insidious well-intended ways that a lot of times parents will do. And you can imagine the damage done by intentionally malicious and abusive parents. But some of the examples that she gave in that book were a parent and a child go to an ice cream parlor, and the child says, "Oh, I really want chocolate ice cream." And the parent says, "What? You don't like chocolate ice cream, you like vanilla." And of course, 'cause, kids are growing and changing, their taste buds are changing, they're wanting to try new things. The parent might have been down this road before where they tried chocolate 4 times and the child didn't like it all 4 of those times. And the parent's thinking to themselves, "I don't really wanna buy a chocolate ice cream cone when I know my child's not gonna eat it, and then we're gonna have to wait in line again, and they're gonna be crying, and it's just gonna like, I've done this, right? Like, I've been down this road. You don't like chocolate, You like vanilla. And so then but then the child might think to themselves, "Well, maybe I don't like chocolate." And so now they start doubting themselves and their preferences and their perception of events, and maybe they had chocolate ice cream at their friend's house for the first time and they absolutely loved it, and the parent doesn't know that. So that's an example of just like a small way that these things can happen. Um, Another example she gave is a child, this is very common, child falls down, hurts themselves, especially with little kids, right? And little kids will kind of like look around, like, did anybody see that? And they're looking for your reaction. And if a parent is very calm and they come over and, you know, the kid will start kind of mirroring that. And so the child is calmer depending on how the parent responds to that. But it's oftentimes parents or caregivers or teachers or whoever or school nurses will tell the child, "Oh, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine." And they're not doing that with any malicious intent. They're doing that to try to calm down maybe a child who's scared. Maybe they scraped their knee for the first time ever and they're like, "Oh my God, what happened? What happened?" Trying to calm down this child. But if you're telling a child, it's okay, you're fine, this kiss will make it feel all better. Well, it's like, actually, no, lady. Like, my knee really hurts. It's bleeding. And that kiss was nice, but it doesn't make it feel okay. And I'm not fine. And so by gaslighting a child and telling them that their reality is other than what they're experiencing it, that starts to separate them at an early age from start questioning their perception of events and feelings and thoughts and all these things. So, um, yes, and so then when you have abuse and different kinds of things in you know different types of situations in especially in abusive families where there's a lot of secrets involved, where it's like, no, that's not a problem. That didn't happen. You don't talk about it. You're fine. You know, and there's all these secrets and these lies, and the reality is really being shaped and twisted. Then of course, right? It makes total sense. Like, as that child gets older, th- what is problematic might be registering as normal or might not be registering as problematic. And what's normal might not be comfortable because they're used to growing up in something that's incredibly problematic. Okay, so what codependency isn't? Codependency is not caregiving, it's not kindness, and it's not interdependency. And so she gives some examples here. She says, taking care of a sick relative or helping someone doesn't make a person codependent. Codependent behavior in a specific situation doesn't make a person codependent. Caretaking is different from caregiving. I liked that she made this distinction. Caregiving comes from a place of abundance. Caretaking emanates from need and deprivation. So we can only give, it's that attitude of abundance. We can only give what we have. And if we're so depleted that we're taking care of somebody, then it just becomes this tremendous burden, and that we don't have the time or the emotional energy or physical strength or energy to do. So she gives the example of two women. Jane and Jill both have mothers who are dying. Jane quits her job so she can take care of her mother for the last few months of her life. She arranges for part time help a few days a week in order to make time for herself. She goes to the gym, talks to friends for support, and does her best under the circumstances to maintain balance and harmony in her life, which nurtures both her and her mother. Jill feels obligated to leave her job to help her mother. She blames and resents her siblings for not sharing her burden, yet doesn't ask that they pitch in. She feels responsible for and worries about her mother's medical treatment. She spends all day with her mother and tries to unsuccessfully convince her to see a faith healer. Jill feels guilty for taking time for herself and is preoccupied with her mother's care and is exhausted all the time. So I think that was a really great example of two different people, same situation, handling it in a healthy way versus handling it in a very classic kind of codependent way of I feel the need to help. I can't comfortably help. I don't have the time or the energy or the finances or what have you. I'm acting from a place of obligation. I'm physically exhausted. I don't like how my and this is the controlling part. I don't like how my mother is getting medical care. I'm trying to control her by being like, "Well, you should see this faith healer and this other doctor," and then just trying to micromanage the situation. Okay, and then she goes on to say that the gal that Jill is caretaking. Her actions have inappropriate responsibility and control written all over it. She feels guilty and resentful because she feels responsible for her mother, yet she neglects her responsibilities to herself. She takes over her mother's treatment, gives unwanted advice, and doesn't ask for help so she can maintain control. Codependents often give until it hurts. Jane, however, doesn't neglect herself, gives care to her mother, and doesn't become resentful. That's such a big shift in how we approach things. Like I just can't even begin to stress that enough. And one of the concepts, I think it was from the book The Respect Me Rules, how they talked about bookending. So if you know, you're like, okay, I'm going into this incredibly stressful situation and um I'm not taking action from fear, obligation, and guilt. This is something that I want to do, but it's got to be within the constructs of what's healthy for me. Is planning ahead of time. What do I need to do to take care of myself ahead of time? And then what do I need to do to take care of myself afterwards? So maybe that's setting up an appointment with a therapist or with a life coach or getting a massage or taking a half day off work or getting allowing yourself to go to bed early or playing relaxing music before and after or playing hardcore music before and after, whatever self-care looks like for you to make this situation that you're doing as supportive and as nourishing for you as possible, because we can't give from an empty bucket. When we start trying to give from an empty bucket, that's when we get really burned out. And for caregivers, there's definitely that level of compassion fatigue and caregiver burnout, which is so common because so many of us oftentimes are attracted to caregiving type fields of being a teacher, a nurse, a therapist, a social worker, um, and giving, 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 giving until and I saw this with nurses right and left, where the older nurses that had been doing this for 20, 30 years were very oftentimes they looked like hell. They had been chewed up and spit out and had no boundaries for years. They were used to working 12-hour shifts without eating or even going to the bathroom. And if they were eating, they were eating garbage out of the vending machine, or they're just not taking care of themselves because it was very much this mentality of and this is literally what was taught to us in nursing school is it's all about patient care. You come last. And I vividly remember at my nursing school graduation, we had to do this whole Florence Nightingale it was I guess it was like a prayer. And I remember thinking, I feel like I'm taking an oath to codependency because I'll have to find it. It was seriously the most ridiculous thing. It was like, whatever you need, I will be there. I will give. I will put you first. It's, you know, like people getting sworn in and saying, it's my life is going to be all about you, basically. And when I was in nursing school, I was saying, like, I'm not okay with that. Like, I'm not going to be treated like garbage by a doctor, and I'm not going to be treated like garbage by patients. And I'm not going to put myself in harm's way. And there were many times where it was really looked upon like you're being difficult. If I didn't want to be alone in a room with a person that was a known murderer or rapist, I mean, like extreme situations. It was like, well, but this is the work we do. So you just need to get okay with it. And I was like, well, then I guess I'm just difficult because I'm not going to be alone with a person that makes me uncomfortable. I don't care if you're comfortable with it. I'm not. And that's my boundary. So, oh, So yes, figuring out what works for you is the point of that. Here's another example she gives for guys, which I thought was interesting. So there's Bill, Brad, and Bob. So all three of these guys enjoy giving to their girlfriends, and they always let the girlfriends choose where they eat. Bill lets his girlfriend choose in order to avoid disappointing her and starting a potential conflict because he's afraid of losing her. Brad's self-esteem is boosted by letting his girlfriend pick pricey restaurants, even though he'd rather order takeout. Bob doesn't care where he eats, but asserts himself on other matters. Bill, the guy who's afraid of being assertive because he doesn't want his girlfriend to leave, fears abandonment. And so he lets his girlfriend choose the restaurant as almost a type of bribery. Bob is acting out of, the other guy is acting out of low self esteem. And Bob is the only one acting out of free choice rather than fear or low self esteem. So even though Bob doesn't care where they eat, he's like, you know what, you can choose. It's the intention that makes the difference. So he might be really passive about dinner. He's like, hey man, food is food, pizza or Chinese, I don't care. I'll eat whatever. But if he's able to comfortably assert himself without fear of her leaving or not tying his self-esteem into being assertive, then he's acting from a much more empowered place. So I thought that was a good example. Okay, let me scroll down here. Okay, interdependency is where both people are equals and take responsibility for their own lives as well as their contribution to the relationship. They want to be together and are concerned about the other person, and their lives and routines are intertwined, but they remain their own person. They don't fear intimacy, and independence is not seen as a threat to the relationship. Where I see a lot of this stuff kind of go south with manipulation, and again, it's hard to see it when you're in it, is oftentimes people that are up to no good, that are lying and cheating, especially, will often say, they'll blame their behavior on the other person. Oh, you're so jealous. You're so paranoid. You're so emotional. This person, guy or gal, means nothing to me, blah, blah, blah. And so for the person that's on the receiving end of this, they might feel like, well, yeah, I mean, I want them to have friends, but it's like, feels like it's more than friends. And is this weird? Is it me? Is it them? Am I too sensitive? Am I jealous? Like, you know, but oftentimes, um, the reality is if a, it's, uh, that kind of stuff. If a person's having squirrely behavior, if they have friends that you haven't met, if they're, you know, chatting with people online, if it's sexy chatting, if you've never met them, like just because a person's talking to another person online doesn't mean that it's appropriate, and it for sure doesn't mean that they're a friend. So a lot of manipulative people will be like, "Oh, that's she's just a friend or he's just a friend. It means nothing to me." And it's like, "Okay, well, if you're I want to meet your friends. Like let's go out if we're all friends." If they're a friend of yours, I want to meet them. But then they'll be like, no, no, you're paranoid, you're jealous, these kinds of things. In a healthy relationship, in a sincere relationship, it doesn't end over, um, if somebody's like, oh, you know what, that other person, they mean nothing to me. That's just a friend. Healthy people with sincere intentions don't end relation. They're not willing to throw away a relationship over nothing or over a friend that they've chatted with online that they recently met. Like that's a really great sign that they're cheating, is what I'm saying. Okay. Uh and frankly, personally, I think it's completely reasonable if people are in a relationship and if you have friends, for your significant other to meet them. If people are hiding their friends, then there's something squirrely going on there. Okay, let's see. So again, the blurring with narcissism and codependency, I see this a lot, and I feel like this is something that's worthy of discussing because interest, and I don't know if you guys have seen this too, but one thing I have noticed is that, and I don't know if it's like like if it's conscious or subconscious, but I have found that a lot of abusive people feel like they are codependent, but they also feel like they're the victim. So they have a very twisted reality about their responsibility and their actions. And that is one thing that does concern me with the concept of codependency, and something to just be aware of too in support groups and talking to other people. Is a lot of abusive people are like, oh, well, I'm really codependent. I finally learned that I matter and that I have self-esteem and that I have value. But then you kind of find out down the road, like this person's a total wackadoo and they're incredibly abusive. And then that can be just that added layer of confusion because like, kind of figuring out who is who. But the difference is, codependent people lack a healthy relationship with their selves. They overgive. They overgive to other people in order to get their needs met. Narcissists take and they take and they take and they take in order to get their needs met. But I think the reason that wiring gets twisted for them is because narcissists are not aware of how much they're taking. And whenever they do something nice for another person, they're holding on to that one moment of what they did give, like, hey, I picked you up from, like, I don't know. Sometimes it's so ridiculous. I watched our child the other night while you went to a yoga class. Something that like a normal a parent would be like, well, you don't, yeah, like you watched your child. Do you know what I mean? Like you don't get points for that. It's, it that's part of being a parent. But in their mind, they're like, I give and I give and I give, and it's never enough for you. But to the other person, they're like, are you kidding me? Like you give crumbs and you give the bare minimum of like appropriate adult behavior, if even that, and you think that you're giving and giving and giving. So that's just something as an aside I've noticed, and often a lot of times a lot of psychopaths will really play up the codependent card of I've been hurt so many times, and I just give and I give and I give, and I just attract all of these really awful, women or men or whatever. And they play like they're that baby bird with a broken wing and that they're incredibly vulnerable. So just because a person, and they might have a trauma history, you know, but just because a person's gone through similar things as you does not mean that they're the same as you. So it's healthy boundaries all the time, all the time. So, well, Heather, boy, she says, Dana, you make this so easy to understand, and this is such a complicated subject. Oh, man, I hope that I feel like I'm only even just scratching the surface on this. There's so much to this, and um, I really hope that I am doing this topic justice. So yeah. And this is a conversation, by the way, I am totally okay with continuing to have. And so I value you guys' feedback and your questions and your experience with all of this and um, all of it. I think it's the magic happens when we start kind of having the discussion around it because this really is a hot topic for like a lot of people. Okay, so codependent people tend to give in order to get their needs met. And they're also often highly invested in keeping relationships together, and they often need to feel needed. And this can lead to a series of relationships, one sided relationships. It's a big thing there with addicts, alcoholics, and people who claim to need rescuing. And this is also known as relationship addiction. because people with codependency often form or maintain relationships that are one-sided, emotionally destructive, and or abusive. And I think too, one of the reasons that it is this kind of addiction or this compulsion or this pattern of behavior is, here's just my take on this, is if we are so out of tune with our own emotions that we're over identifying with other people's emotions, then I think it's just in a weird twisted way, like if it's difficult for us to get our emotional needs met, or any needs, physical needs, emotional needs, self-esteem needs, then we're trying to get them met through other people. And when we can get those boundaries back into place where we realize, here is me, here's where I start and I end, and here's where you start and you end. And, my thoughts and feelings and wants and needs are my own and yours are your own. And we can respect each other's space. You know, I think that's the whole goal, right? But it can be very difficult, um, because it takes a lot of time for a person that's in that codependent zone to get back into alignment and start getting more in tune with their feelings. So, and then I think too, there's this weird kind of not only enmeshment, but probably a lot of more of like that controlling part with codependency and that blurring of boundaries, where we're probably projecting a lot of our thoughts and feelings and emotions onto other people because we're so out of tune with our own stuff. And so we're thinking, oh well, they just really need to do that, or they must be thinking this, or they must be feeling this. But the reality is we don't know because we're not them. And the mind is a fascinating thing, you know? So I don't know. I'll be curious to see what people think about that. Uh, let's see here. Let me scroll down. Okay, so some of the differences between high and low self-esteem. So high self-esteem, I'm going to say healthy self-esteem because I think high self-esteem kind of has a negative connotation for a lot of people. Healthy self-esteem knows that you're okay, knows that you have value and that you matter and you feel competent. Likes yourself, exhibits honesty and integrity, trusts yourself, has compassion for others, shows responsibility to self and others, accepts praise and attention, are hopeful for the future, has respect and compassion for herself and others. And low self esteem tends to come across as feeling not enough, comparing ourselves to others, lacking self worth and value, asking others' opinion. That is such a big one. I tell you, that one flies under the radar, I think, for so many people that, because if a person's so used to looking to other people to just be like, well, what do you think I should do? And, um, like, we're just so out of tune with what we think. Needing other people's approval and are self-critical, defer to, agree with, and pleases others, doubts self and feels indecisive, are critical of others and sensitive to criticism, discounts our own feelings, wants, and needs, deflects or doubts praise and dislikes attention, lacks confidence and self-efficacy, lacks self-respect and self-compassion. And so the self-respect and actually, let's talk about self-compassion real quick, because what oftentimes happens is if we're so in tune with other people's emotions, whether or not they're like a narcissist or just another person that's hurting, we can oftentimes start putting ourselves on the back burner, and we give and we give and we give, just like that example of the gal she was talking about. Her mother was dying, she's like, okay, I need to be there, and then just does not take care of herself at all. Like, I'll be there around the clock, and if you need me, you call, and I'll do all of the cooking and all of the cleaning and go to all of the doctor's appointments, and I'm gonna quit my job, and I'm just gonna, and then her health is, like, deteriorating because she's so out of balance because she's taking care of her mother. If we're so used to feeling the need of, like, I need to show compassion to other people, which is a really great trait, but to an extent. If we're not showing compassion for ourselves, if we're again, do we would never ask somebody that we loved to do that for us, right? We would never be like, "Okay, I need you to be on call 24/7. I need you to skip meals. I need you to quit your job. I need you to be here. I need you to take care of me. I need you to," like, that's we would never do that for somebody. We would never expect somebody to do that for us. And so expecting ourselves to be in that one-sided dynamic where it's just this bomb goes off in our life out of even if we're coming from a good place of like, well, this is compassion, it's that compassion is only complete if it includes ourselves. So finding that middle ground and again, thinking of ourselves in terms of um, that our adult self and then our inner child. How would we talk to a child that we loved or a person that we loved? What kind of expectations would we have for a child or a person that we loved? And are we expecting different things from ourselves? And are we talking to ourselves differently? Because it should all be the same, right? We should talk, if we care about another person, we're going to, build them up. We're going to focus on the positive. We're going to get a plan to build on the strengths. We're gonna you know see what I'm saying? Like we're gonna, nurture them and make sure that they're eating nourishing food and that they're getting enough sleep and that they are taking care of themselves. So, okay, let's see here. And we've talked about self-trust and following inner guidance. That's so important and that's so common with people that are struggling with being out of alignment like that. That it's very, and of course too, then the more trauma that you go through, the more difficult that is to trust again. And especially if you're going through a lot of like emotional and psychological abuse, where your perception of reality is continued to be rewritten by this, you know, incredibly abusive person, it's very difficult for a person to get that back. And um, I think there's always going to be some degree of doubt there. But like we talked about earlier, if you're feeling knocked off center, if you feel like somebody took a magnet to like your internal compass, if you're feeling confusion, that's not normal. Even though if you're like, no, no, it is normal. I have PTSD. I feel like this all the time. Get grounded, get as grounded as you possibly can, and think about who you feel comfortable with, and then back yourself up emotionally from that person or that situation. And journaling can really help to kind of figure out, okay, what's going on here? Why am I feeling this way? Being a people pleaser, people that are not centered within themselves are often, desperately want others to validate, like, love, or need them. They may feel anxious if others are unhappy with them and give other people's needs, feelings, and opinions precedent over their own. Most people are uncomfortable with conflict. And so there's and she gives the example, it's one thing to try to please your boss, but it's another thing to try to want to please everybody around you. And in my own life, that was a big aha moment because I realized it was that Pete Walker book, the book on complex PTSD, from surviving to thriving, I think. Anyway, Pete Walker, famous book, great book. And he talks about the different personality styles that kind of form around different types of traumatic events in a person's life. And that level of ingratiating behavior, we're trying to keep the peace, trying to avoid conflict, um, kind of trying to quote unquote friend our way out of the situation. very insightful when you start realizing if that's kind of the bend that you have in your personality of when you're doing that and why you're doing that and how can you go about doing it differently. Della, oh, they're talking about the CPTSD book. Yeah, it seriously is fantastic. Somebody made a comment. I don't remember if it was in the group or in the live stream. It just was so fantastic. She said it was so eye-opening for her to realize that she always thought that this was like her personality, this kind of caregiving, people pleasing, um, personality. She's like, I always thought this was my personality. She's like, I built my whole profession around it. And then I realized that it was a defense mechanism to an abuse. I get goosebumps even thinking about that. Like you realize, oh my God, who am I? Like this isn't me. I had to walk on eggshells to navigate my home life. And of course, too, that's the insidious part of codependency and these kinds of behaviors that tend to stem from this, like the people pleasing, the being kind of go with the flow, the being a doormat, the not having boundaries, not knowing, not being able to trust yourself, not being grounded in yourself is um, when you start realizing, okay, this is where this stuff comes from, and this behavior is oftentimes rewarded by society. You know, oh, you're so likable. She's such a good student. She's no trouble whatsoever, you know, and it's rewarded. And so then it really flies under the radar and it can take a person. And again, too, like that's the level of crazy making. Then if you're in these different types of, um, different types of groups where, so like, for example, like for me, right? So I was a teacher for a while and then I worked at a domestic violence shelter and then did domestic violence. I was an advocate there and then I worked as a psychiatric nurse. And so all of these kinds of caregiving type behaviors, that was not only a big part of who I was, then I had my 20 years, right? Like different careers surrounding these things. And always thinking, "Oh, I thought this was what we were all supposed to be doing. I thought I was being a good person. I didn't realize that this was problematic." And it's very jarring when you start waking up to that. And then it's very jarring when you start waking up to it and you start to get things more into alignment and start saying no. I'd given the example at my job. It was just understood like, well, you're a nurse and you just sacrifice yourself in whatever way we need. Like that was just and I think most nurses can agree, like that's just how it is, right? Patients need you. You eat when you have a chance to eat. And you're selfish if you need to go to the bathroom or if you need to eat or if you need to take time off and you give and you give and you give. And when I started saying no, like, no, I'm not going to work through lunch. It's my time. And no, I'm not going to stay late. And no, I'm not going to do that. Like, I love you guys, but I got things to do. And it's not I'm going to go and relax during lunch or I'm going to go for a walk. And people they're like, whoa, wait, what? What's wrong with her? And people will start interacting with you differently the more you start asserting yourself. And it just changes everything and it's uncomfortable for everyone involved. But then you kind of get to the place where you're like, man, it's uncomfortable saying no, but it's more uncomfortable saying yes, because that's when that resentment and that irritation start building up. And, you're exhausted and hungry and you got to go to the bathroom and like your life's not working because your life has become all about somebody else. So, okay, let's see. Yes, postmodern's talking about DBT therapy is fantastic. There's books. You can go on Amazon and get books. It stands for dialectical behavioral therapy, and it's has its roots in mindfulness. And I would frankly, I'd say there's a lot of like kind of westernized Buddhist philosophy having to do with it. So it's all about processing, identifying emotions, detaching from emotions, kind of watching them as they surface. Um, it's fantastic. I just wish that stuff in particular, DBT stuff, was taught in elementary school. What a different world we would have, because it's great, great skills. And the Fed says, I give, and after a while I get exhausted, then I get irritated, then the other person gets angry at me and everything gets screwed up. Yep. Yeah, it's, and if you can start kind of backing that up and giving from a place of like, this is really what you want to do, and instead of like fear, obligation is just a huge driver of giving for a lot of people. Fear, obligation, or guilt, and you're giving from a place of like, "Oh, I really wanna do that." Like, I in setting boundaries. That's such a big man, I tell you, it's just getting in tune with yourself. So if you're like if a friend asks you, "Hey, man, you know, can you help me move?" Right? Like, "I'm moving this weekend," and you're like, "I really don't wanna do that." But you're like, "Yeah, I can help you. I can help you for, like, maybe 3 hours on Saturday." And your friend's like, "Oh, man, really? You've got a pickup truck," and then but if you're like, "You know what? I don't wanna spend all weekend long moving my friend. And even though they're my friend, I don't want that's too much. It's too much. I've got plans. I wanna spend time with my kids. I wanna take time off," like, whatever, Like, you don't have to justify it. It's your weekend. But saying, "Hey, man, you know what? Yeah, I've got a pickup truck. We're more than happy to help you. Let's prioritize it. We'll move the heavy stuff in the pickup truck or the furniture in the pickup truck. I'll be there at noon, be more than happy to help you until 3 o'clock or whatever." And kind of reining that in to where you're being like, "I would love to help you as a friend, but within limits." So learning to realize it's okay to have limits, or if a parent, even if it's a parent or a sibling that you really enjoy being around, and they're like, "Yo, you know what? I really want to see you, and I got this great deal on airline tickets, and I can stay for 3 weeks." And you're thinking to yourself, "Man, that's like a long time." Kind of figuring out, okay, what would work for you? 3 weeks is a long time for anybody. So maybe if it was a week, maybe it's 3 days, whatever. And then saying, "Hey, I would love to have you here, but I think that it's going to be too much. It's just not going to work for me. You're more than welcome to come stay for, 3 or 5 days. We'd love to have you." But, and honestly, most people, because when you, when a person's acting from a place of sincerity, like, "Yeah, man, I would be all about helping you move. 4 hours on Saturday, I can help you move Saturday afternoon, but I really wanna make sure I'm home, we're gonna barbecue tonight," or whatever. When they realize that you're saying what you mean and that you're not taking action from obligation, it not only helps your friendship, but there's just no tension, like, people can breathe, and it's just things are so much better because they're not worried about, "Oh, does he feel guilty, like he owes me?" And you see what I'm saying? Like, there's just not that level of discomfort there because people are doing things because they want to, and they're able to maintain their boundaries and not let even people that they like unintentionally cross them. And Postmodern says, the healthiest person says, "No, I can't. I still don't know how to say that." Which is interesting because a healthy person that is not codependent seems harsh, but in reality, they are healthy. They are not harsh. Yeah. And there's lots of different ways. I don't know. I think there's something to be said for tact. Um, you know, but yeah, it's however a person wants to say. what they want to say. I think as long as when a person's operating from a standpoint of sincerity, and it takes practice. Like, I think with setting boundaries, something that can help, because there's oftentimes this knee jerk compulsion to be accommodating, and to break that up and give yourself space and say, you know what, can I get back to you on that? Can help. Just having that phrase, can I get back to you on that, can help break up that, or interrupt that pattern of that knee jerk compulsion to agree, and then feel like, oh man, I just agreed to work all weekend long and I don't want to. Now I got to figure out a way to get out of it. And so that insincere communication is agreeing when we saying yes when we mean no, and then pretend calling in sick at the last minute because we're not comfortable. We were never comfortable just saying no to begin with, versus saying something like, your boss comes in, hey, can you work this weekend? And just saying, can I get back to you on that? And then, like you said, then saying, oh, you know what? I can't. Sorry. Or, I can't. I hope you can find somebody else. And then, but it helps to just give yourself some time, break that pattern, and then get comfortable with saying that. Yeah. Saying no is oftentimes difficult for most people. Yeah. It's so great. It's so great when you can have start having that open, honest, sincere, solutions oriented communication with people. And, I had used the example. I was out with a friend for lunch the other day, and we ended up having a conversation about abuse and, um, my relationship with Jack. And I began getting really heated to the point where I was incredibly reactive. And I really don't have that many times where I'm reactive. It's always interesting to me when I find when buttons get pushed that I didn't realize that were still there, or our triggers get tripped that I didn't realize were still there. And I was very reactive, and I embarrassed myself because I was getting so upset. And it was really nice to be able to go back and talk to her later and just say, you know what, I'm really sorry. Like, I really snapped at you, and this is a conversation. I said, it didn't dawn on me that I could have just kind of bowed out of that conversation. And that's what I should have done. And she had said, she's like, I'm just trying to understand where you're coming from. And I said, I get it. I get it that you don't get it, that because you didn't go through it. And I don't hold that against you. Um, the situation, it just really caught me off guard. But it was nice to be able to talk about it. And it was nicer to have that realization of, in the future, if a conversation starts getting uncomfortable, even with when it's a friend, that I don't have to engage in that I can shut that down and just say, you know what, let's just change the topic. This is not going to go anywhere. Like, I don't want to have this conversation. I think for so long, I was so used to thinking about boundaries in terms of with toxic people and dangerous and destructive people and creepers and those kinds of people, instead of thinking about it in terms of with people that I like with friends that I like and family that I like, and realizing that boundaries are something that are it's an extension of us. They're an extension of our standards, and they're in every single aspect of our life. And I guess that's been a new wave of awareness, realizing, maybe that's so obvious, I don't know, but like realizing that they're everywhere. And they'll be easier to set with some people than with others. So let's see here. Oh, and she goes into different types of boundaries. She said, okay, there's 3 types of dysfunctional boundaries: weak, broken, and rigid. Boundaries affect every aspect of your life and how you interact with the world. They include material, physical, including sexual, mental, and emotional. So, material boundaries refer to sharing your possessions and money, giving and loaning without discretion. And this is a big thing. I think it's, speaking from like a woman's perspective, when I was younger, especially when I had roommates, I don't know if guys go through this as much as girls do, but very like you live with the best way to ruin a friendship is to live with the other person. And, you know, we best friends borrowing each other's clothes, not asking, what's yours is mine and what's mine is yours. And of course that goes south really quickly. And people eat each other's food, and it's just there's no respect for boundaries because it's this deep level of from familiarity with this other person, but to an unhealthy degree, especially if you've got friends where everybody's kind of a people pleaser and nobody's comfortable with saying no. Because it's like, oh, well, we're friends until things get pushed so far that they finally explode. And then, even then, it's not appropriately addressed, right? Like they apologize for exploding, but then, like, the original issue of getting boundaries more in alignment are still not discussed. But it's okay to have boundaries surrounding possessions and money, and even if you're married, even if you have children, even if to just have an understanding of, okay, what are we doing here? This is a big thing too when people are getting into like second marriages, third marriages, there's multiple children involved, to be very clear ahead of time, like when you're dating, understandings about money, about possessions, about whose is whose and what's what, and what are the expectations. Are we both going to be combining funds to buy a house or to pay for schooling or for a car or what have you? Because most people tend to go into situations, we all think that we're the baseline for normal. And so the way that we tend to think about the world is like, well, we just think, well, other people must think that way too. And if they don't, then maybe there's something wrong with them, right? Because that's just how most people are wired. And so then it takes a certain degree of like emotional awareness to realize what's common and normal for me is not going to be common and normal for somebody else. So if maybe it was in our family, the expectation that you bought your own car, if that other person's thinking, oh, I know I was planning on buying my child a car when they turn 16, but then you have a child that you brought into that marriage that you're not planning on buying a car for. Like, feelings can get hurt, things can get muddled very, very quickly. So having understandings about how are we going to spend money? How are we going to save money? How are we going to invest? And then just all of it, the combination, possessions, giving and loaning. I see this too with a lot of people with parents that have an attitude of entitlement. And if there's the expectation of, I'm your parent, you should, if my air conditioning goes out, you should pay for it. If I need anything, that you should help me. And so very narcissistic parents making their adult children feel obligated to take care of them, which can obviously cause a lot of issues within a relationship. So it's just really important to get on the same page. And then that way you're not being triangulated against your spouse and doing sneak in funds to a controlling parent or anything like that. And really kind of, if that is the dynamic, like getting on the same page with the spouse and just saying, okay, we're a unified front here. So, we've decided as a team, like, we're not going to loan money to friends and family, period, of end of story. Nothing to do with you. Like, that's just our family rule. Or we don't, yeah, like, we don't loan money. you know so these kinds of things are good to examine. Physical and sexual boundaries refers to your privacy in how, whom, and when you allow someone to enter your space or touch you. When children are denied a right of privacy or control over their bodies, their physical boundaries are violated. You can get a sense of people's boundaries by how close they stand to you, whether they offer a handshake, a hug, or a kiss. If you pull away and they persist, then you know that they're not respecting your boundaries and that theirs are different than yours. Another example of this is somebody that calls at inappropriate hours or launches into a one-sided monologue without any sensitivity to like what you're doing or what's going on, how you feel about that. But the listener in those kinds of situations is also not setting limits and also lacks boundaries. So, some examples of weak boundaries are thinking that you don't have a right to privacy with others, especially with your spouse, with emotional things like therapy, or feeling that you need to answer every question that's asked of you. So, I see this with dating, and I used to feel this way. Like if somebody had asked, well, how many people have you slept with? It's okay for you to be like, you know what? That is not like, I don't really want to answer that. That is a no win question for either person. But that's something, I mean, everybody's going to feel differently about that. So some people might, I think it's just important to realize that you don't have to answer every question that somebody asks of you. And, or if somebody asks, how much money do you make? Your parents are really excited. You got a new job. Oh, well, how much money are you making? You don't need to answer that. Um, or I like the example of feeling like you don't have a right to privacy with, especially with your spouse, and especially with emotional things like therapy. So if you're getting into therapy and your spouse is like, "Well, what did you talk to with your therapist?" and they want to know details, a lot of people can feel like, "Well, we shouldn't have boundaries in marriage. We shouldn't have secrets. We shouldn't have privacy, and it's okay for you to not tell another person every single thing that's going on with you." Personal Some examples of uh, personal boundaries with children would be, and this is very common, right, with older relatives being like, oh, well, you know what, go give Aunt Margaret a big hug and kiss, and Aunt Margaret's 105 years old, and to a little kid that's scary. She's really old and wrinkly, and that she's kind of scary, and so that little kid might be like, I don't really want to go give her a hug and kiss, but then they're forced into it. Or go give uncle, Bob, go ahead and go sit on his lap or go play with him. And if the child's like, actually, that person really kind of gives me the creeps. I see this a lot. You know what I see this a lot with is people that are big time partiers and will oftentimes call other of their party friends to tell their child everybody's aunt and uncle. That's Auntie Dana, that's uncle, Travis, that's uncle so and so, and they might be a total stranger that's their first time over there. And so then this child has a very skewed sense of who is safe and who is not safe, because I see this a lot with alcoholics. Um, and I just, yeah, and especially if you get a bunch of creepy people over and the child's thinking, "Oh, but that's auntie or uncle so and so, and but they should be safe." And especially, if you've got an addict or an alcoholic as a parent and they're kind of um oh, what would be the word? Like um abdicating their parental duties and being like, well, auntie so and so is going to go tuck you in or give you a bath or do these things, and like that person's a virtual stranger. And so just very, very, very non-existent, non-appropriate boundaries. um yeah, very common. Mental boundaries. This is I like I'd never thought about boundaries in all these different categories before, and I really like that she mentioned this. Mental boundaries apply to opinions and beliefs about and whether you can formulate and hold on to your own views when challenged without becoming rigid. If you become confused, lose hold of your own opinion, or become angry, These can all be signs that you've been minimized or invalidated in the past. And it's difficult. It's difficult to engage in discussions with other. Most people feel strongly about the way that they feel, especially when it comes to hot topics like politics or, you know, just hot button kind of issues. And I think it's also important to realize that you don't need to engage in conversations with people that don't share, certain things that you really that are core values to you. Like, you don't need to engage in a conversation and stay open-minded with a person who's racist or sexist or abusive or, what have you. Like, it's okay to just not have certain conversations, and not even that extreme. Like, it's okay to just not have certain conversations that you are feeling angry about, or that are not going to end well, that you don't agree on. So, yeah. Emotional boundaries, defining your emotional rights and responsibilities and separating yourself from those of others. People with healthy emotional boundaries don't lose themselves in intimate relationships. That's a big one. Each person's identity remains clear. They can be close but still remain whole. Codependents often struggle with sensing the differences between their feelings and the feelings of someone else, or they might not be aware of when their boundaries are being respected or disrespected. You may not know why you're upset or what you're feeling, or you may be unable to name your hurt, humiliation, or anger. You may not get angry for days, if at all. You can't tell someone to stop hurting you until you are aware that you are being hurt, and even then, you might not feel entitled to assert your rights. Poor emotional boundaries can make you feel responsible for, and at times even guilty, when you hear someone else's problem or negative feelings. You have the impulse to do something when someone else is upset. Their problems and responsibilities become yours. You take on more than 50% of the responsibility in a relationship. And if it's not working, you blame yourself. That's so huge. And really let that sink in. You know, are you feeling the need to sink yourself to save someone else or to save this relationship? Are you doing all the work? Is all you're getting from this other person promises of change? This time it'll be different. They will go to therapy. They'll stop lying. They'll stop cheating. They're going to start going to church. It's just talk, 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 talk. Please realize it doesn't take a lot of effort to say words. Actions are what matter. Actions are what matter. So if you're doing all the action, you're going to therapy, you're trying to go, you're reading books on this, you're going to marriage retreats, and you're talking to people, and you're taking all of this action, and you're continually trying to get them on track, and get them sober, and get them to quit being abusive, and talk to them, and getting them to watch videos, and dragging that horse to water is basically what it is, in hopes that they'll change. Something's really off. And that will, over time, it'll absolutely exhaust, if not kill, a person to spend that much energy. It's like carrying another person on your back, like you're piggybacking the other person the whole time. And especially, and if they're abusive, they're criticizing you and grinding you down, and they don't, it's just yeah. So, okay. The enmeshed selves. If you're enmeshed with somebody, you feel responsible for and you react to their partner's feelings, needs, actions, and problems, but don't think clearly about your own needs and feelings, nor take responsibility for them. You feel happy when they're happy and sad when they are sad. Two people become one and they become fused. There's no room for discussion, disagreement, or separateness. That's huge. That's such a big part of an abusive relationship. One person is a doormat or a caretaker without a sense of separate rights, values, and feelings. And that's exactly the abusers like, "What do you mean? Like, it's just all about me all of the time, and if it's not all about me, then you're being mean to me. You're trying to control me." They spin it around, you know? It's like, it to me, that's not even in the ballpark of workable behavior. That's so to untangle somebody's mental wiring like that is I don't even think it's possible, and really the partner of the person is not gonna be the one to do it anyhow. And therapy oftentimes makes them worse because, I mean, they're so convincing, and I think they believe all the garbage that they're spewing most of the time, that to an outside person, whether that's a spiritual advisor or a therapist, even a really highly skilled one, if a person's coming in and they're, telling another person, "This is this person's so mean to me, they tried to set a boundary with me," like, it could, and there's no other witness to that person's reality, it can be very difficult for that spiritual advisor or therapist or what have you to see what's really going on. So, um, rigid boundaries. This is a very common thing for people that have been abused. This is where boundaries become so rigid. This is also called fortressing, where boundaries become so rigid and thick for self protection, a person ends up lonely out of fear of being hurt again because they haven't learned to protect themselves. They become distant and seem invulnerable, and their relationships lack sharing and are full of inflexible rules. They may isolate socially or use work, addiction, or activity to avoid intimacy. They may erect self protective walls of silence, anger, distrust, and cynicism about people and life. Their body language tells people to stay away, and like a wounded animal that withdraws in self protection because it feels vulnerable. If a family lacked closeness or touching or had negative rules about self expression, then they may have learned to have rigid boundaries. Rigid boundaries can be caused by trauma as a child or adult, too. So, very understandable if a person's been hurt time and time again. And, um, you know, a lot of like, a lot of these lessons with all of this people tend to learn them in waves. Like I was saying, it's taken me 6, 7 years to even really I was trying to actively squeeze out as much as I possibly could, and I'm still learning a ton of stuff. And so, but if you're learning new skills and you're applying new skills at the same time, but if like it took, for example, like it took me, I kept getting caught up with the love bombing. I kept getting Um, I had poor boundaries with friendships. I was in a lot of very unhealthy friendships that were one sided. And I continually went around feeling used, abused, and exploited or neglected. And I didn't know why. And I just kind of felt cursed. So it took me a long time to, my guess is you'll have a similar thing where you'll have these aha moments. You'll start applying the lessons that you've learned, and then you'll keep having aha moments, but it's very difficult if it's a trial by fire, because if you're practicing these new skills, but then if got this pattern of like having traumatizing people around you, it's like you're trying to both learn new skills and practice new skills and then heal from trauma all at the same time. It can be very difficult. So I think, having these really rigid boundaries is a very normal even though it's seen as unhealthy. I think it's very normal for a person to get to that place where you become very self-protective and isolate and just be like, you know what, I'm just done. Like, I don't want to date anymore. I don't want to really get to know people. Like, I just want to be alone. But with time and with learning about, going slow and um, kind of interacting with the world in a very different way, realizing that you can trust yourself, and if something feels off, it's because it's off, and that you can back things up at any given time. All of these lessons will help keep you safe, and they'll help to restore that trust. Okay, broken or mixed boundaries. So if you have broken boundaries, then you have limits some of the time in certain situations or with certain people. It's like I was saying earlier, I felt like I did fine with men, but I was terrible with boundaries with friends. You might have good boundaries, but lose them under stress, or you may be able to set limits with some people, but not others. You may flip from weak to rigid boundaries too quickly, especially after being hurt, and you may move really quick and then push a person away. So, the not being able to set limits, I think a lot of that's kind of that knee jerk reaction thing. If we're so used to saying yes, or if we get knocked off balance, like, and if your boss kind of catches you in the hallway and they're like, hey, can you work this weekend? It can feel like this knee jerk thing if we're used to people pleasing. We have a hard time saying no, to have that knee jerk reaction of being like, okay, like, oh, dude, why did I say that? So to anticipate being knocked off balance and to have a phrase like that of, hey, can I get back to you? That's my go-to phrase. Hey, can I get back to you on that? It buys you some time and it gets a person out of that reaction mode. So then you can respond with what you really want to do. Okay. And codependency codependents are dependent upon someone or something outside of themselves. This dependency often comes from low self-esteem and fear of abandonment. And we went over a lot of the signs and stuff before. And she says, when you're single, if a person is codependent, when they're single, they're looking for somebody else to make them happy. When they're dating, they are looking to make that person happy. In neither situation are they making the time to make themselves happy. We either focus on making somebody else happy, or we're trying to wait around for somebody else to make us happy. We're rarely content with ourselves and become overly invested in pleasing or helping other people whom can't read this, whom you begin to depend upon to fill the gaps in yourself. Soon you're reacting to and controlled by that person's feelings, their needs, their behavior, and you try to control the other person to feel better rather than honor your needs and feelings. So there's a lot of fear of rejection that tends to go along with codependency. Fears of being rejected, or being alone play a big role in dependent relationships. If you're disconnected from yourself, you won't feel complete. You won't have an inner life to sustain and nurture you, and being alone can feel empty, like no one is home or like you are a shell. If you're unable to meet your needs, you'll hope that somebody else will. And there's a big difference between being alone and being lonely. And a lot of that has to do with kind of that inner self. And if you're able to entertain yourself and you have hobbies and you have friends, and you're in tune with what you like and what you don't like, again, like, you can entertain yourself, then alone time can be a time to rest and become rejuvenated. And it's not a bad thing. It's oftentimes, a person can like really look forward to that. But being lonely is that sense of emptiness, of almost kind of being in this holding pattern, waiting until, you're in a relationship, or waiting until somebody else comes home, or, your life is so built around other people. I think a lot of parents oftentimes struggle with this too, with children, when their kids get older and they move out, and then there's kind of that empty nest syndrome where they're like, well, now what? Now who am I? I've spent the last 20 years revolving in this orbit around my child, and I don't know who I am and what I like and what I don't like. And I feel like all of my maybe the one thing that I'm really good at is actually raising children. And so there's just this sense of emptiness and lack of direction if they're not actually taking care of somebody else. So that kind of wraps it up for tonight. I do want to talk about the second half of the book, where she goes into a lot of examples about getting to know us, getting to know ourselves. So let's do that next Thursday if you guys are game for it. So 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the second half of this book. We've been talking about the book Codependency for Dummies by Darlene Lancer, chock full of information, and we're just going to do our best to discuss it. So, you guys, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you guys next week. So, lots of love to you. You are not alone. You are not crazy, and you really can move forward and heal from this. So, take care and have a good night.